Welcome, everyone, to the second fabulous day of the Nexus of Knowledge, Science, Medicine, and Technology on the Silk Road conference workshop here, sponsored by the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. And we've had a very exciting couple of days already, and we are shaping up to have another really rich day of presentations today. So our first panel today, you're here to see Pharmacopeia and Materia Medica. And our first presenter is Yan Liu from State University of New York, Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo. He's an associate professor, and his first book came out in June 2021. It was called Healing with Poisons, Potent Medicines in Medieval China, published by University of Washington Press. And I've been looking forward to meeting him for a long time because of this shared interest. And by the way, I just have to say what a wonderful job Sanjot Mahendali has done in bringing people together over these past few days that really have shared common interests within these panels. And so Yan Liu has, his book is about the cultural history of poisons as healing agents, highlighting the shifting boundary between medicines and poisons. He also has articles on mercury in Chinese medicine and alchemy, co-authored with Shigehisa Koriyama from 2020. Another article entitled Words, Demons, and Illness, Incantatory Healing in Medieval China from 2019, and some interesting public writing on the concept of efficacy, yen, in Chinese medicine and other topics. His second book project, which I believe the current talk is coming from, is, you can see the title here on the screen, Sent from Afar, is the working title of your book, I believe. So without further ado, I'm very happy to invite Yan Liu.
Oh, thank you very much, Stacey, for your very kind introduction. And first of all, I'd just like to thank the Tang Centers for Silk Road Studies, especially Sanjo for kindly inviting me to be here, and also Frank for the great organizational work, and Mindy and Sky for making everything work so smoothly. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I have learned quite a lot from all of you in the past 2 days. And really make me believe that, echoing what Amanda said yesterday, that, the future of Silk Road Study is really inviting scholars from multiple disciplines, regional focus, linguistic skills together, including science and humanities, right? So to push the field forward. So really excited to be here. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my talk today, which is a part of a new project on the transcultural history of aromatics in medieval China. So this is a map of the Silk Road from Warren Hansen's book. You can see that the Silk Road is basically multiple routes in multiple directions, including both the overland routes and also the maritime routes. And along these various connections and routes, we find the circulation, a variety of substances and knowledge associated with them. And we have learned quite a lot of talks yesterday about textiles, about plants, knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and geography and cartography. And so as a medical historian, naturally my interest lies in medicinal substances circulated along the Silk Road from very early on, from ancient time to medieval period to the modern period. So there are generations of scholars studying this for more than a century, actually, right? So someone mentioned the classical work of Bernard Laufer, Sino-Iranica, published more than a century ago with linguistic and philological study of some of the plants circulated between Iran and China, which still remains a useful resource for my research. And more recent works expand the scale of the study and using more materials available in the past decades, such as bringing the Indian Ocean world into the conversation. This edited volume 7 years ago, I think, by Anna Winterbottom and Basil Vespe, I think, the co-editor's name. And also in the field of history science, a keen interest in the circulation of knowledge and transformation of knowledge along the Silk Road across Afro-Eurasia, right? This edited volume a few years ago by Pamela Smith. And of course, one of the participants here in the conference, the recent book published by Ronit here, exciting new book on the study of medicine, medical knowledge, circulating on both ends of the Silk Roads, incorporating exciting materials of Jewish healing tradition and Tibetan healing tradition. So really excited to see that book to be out and pushing the field forward. So my talk focus on a subset of this medicinal substances, not just medicinal substances. It has a broad implication in pre-modern world called xiang in Chinese. I translate xiang as aromatics in English with some reservation because aromatics in modern context often invites the association with perfumes. Of course, that's part of the value appreciated in pre-modern China and elsewhere in the world, but not just that, right? So it acquired a variety of values such as a medicine, right, healing agents, as substance for making incense, particularly in religious rituals, as well as in Buddhist rituals, they use aromatics quite a lot. So I use English word aromatic to refer to this broad sense of substances that emit fragrance for a variety of values. So give you some examples of the prominent aromatics on the Silk Roads. They often came from not East Asia, from somewhere else in Asia, starting from the West Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and East African, the frankincense, Luxiang. We have saffron from North Indian Kashmir region. We have sandalwoods from South Asia and Malay Peninsula, and agarwood from Southeast Asia, and camphor, which is the focus of my talk here, from Borneo and Sumatra. Right? So in comparison to the very extensive study of some of these substances, often called spices or aromatics, their flow from various Asian places to Europe, the study of these substances, their lives in East Asian cultures had not been fully explored. The Japanese scholar Yamada Kentaro's early works published in 50s and 60s remain quite an exception in the study of these substances in East Asian cultures, primarily based on post-11th century sources. In my talk, I want to give you a general picture of the history of aromatics in medieval China. So medieval here is an expedient term referring to the period of time from 3rd to 13th century. That's my period of focus. So 3 sub-periods here. So this is era division. So you do see this kind of political division between the northern regimes established by the various nomadic peoples of Turkic, Mongolian, and Tibetan peoples, and a succession of Han regimes established in the south. And this is a moment that witnessed the transmission and also the flourishing of Buddhism in both parts. So that naturally brought a lot of aromatics and knowledge associated with them into China, so particularly in the practice of burning incense in Buddhist rituals. In the following centuries, the Sui Tang period, we see the incorporation of many, if not all of these substances, aromatic substances, into the medical writings, particularly material medical writings from the 7th century on. And then in the following period of Song, we see a wider repercussion these aromatics had on the society, facilitated by the flourishing of the maritime trade. That imported massive amount of aromatics from Southeast Asia and South Asia, mediated by the Arabic and Persian traders. And so not just in medicine, in religious rituals, these substances acquired diverse social values among the literati, social elites, in the culture of burning incense, etc., etc. Right, so my talk primarily focused on the Sui and Tang period. If I have extra time, I would like to talk about the Song period a little bit. my central research question for this talk is how did the circulation of aromatics along the Silk Roads generate new knowledge of healing in medieval China? So early generation scholars such as Edward Schaeffer, in his book published in the 1960s, The Golden Peach of Samarkand, talk about aromatics, particularly these exotic substances from faraway places that elicited fantasies, imaginations, particularly in Tang literature, Tang culture. So my question is more about how these substances, once imported into China, oftentimes based on sometimes second-hand, sometimes first-hand experience of them, generate new knowledge, particularly in medical culture. So I want to use the dragon brain aromatic as a case study here. I realized in the abstract I mentioned both saffron and dragon brain aromatic. Due to the time constraint, I don't have time to talk about saffron. And if you are interested in that story, I have a forthcoming article this summer on that story published at the Harvard Journal of Asian Studies. So if you're interested, you can check that out. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on dragon brain aromatics. So what is dragon brain aromatics? It's generally referred to a camphor product, a resin, the crystalline product isolated from a camphor tree growing in either Southeast Asia or South Asia. I'll elaborate on that in a minute. So this is a very tall tree, so could be as tall as 100 feet. That's over 30 meters with a girth of 6 to 8 feet. And it's evergreen tree. And the resins you can see shown on the right side is isolated from the inside of the trunk of the tree. You need to chop the trunk and get the resin out of it. It's a very laborious effort to do it. And there's a whole ritual associated with it in the local region of Indonesia. So I don't have time to talk about that. I can leave that in the Q&A. So, but I want to remind you that there's a variety of camphor out there. This is based on R.A. Duncan's work on a global history of camphor, published about 15 years ago. So we have the Borneo camphor, originating from the Southeast Asia, particularly Borneo, northern Borneo, southern Malay Peninsula, and western Sumatra. So this is the most expensive, most valued camphor in the medieval China, and also in India. So a second camphor, a common camphor, growing in South China, Taiwan, and southern Japan. This is entirely different species called Zhang or Zhangmu in Chinese sources, not really incorporated into medicine or religious rituals in medieval period, but became much more important from 19th century on when the timber of that became industrial material for making celluloid. And Japan had a monopoly on that for quite a while, with the rise of, before the rise of synthetic camphor in 20th century. So that's an entirely different modern story. But a third one, Malabar camphor came from southern Indian, less frequently mentioned in the pre-modern sources, but sporadically mention of it. It's more closely related to the common camphor than the Borneo camphor, sometimes generated some kind of confusion between Malabar and Borneo camphor because of the trading activity between South Asia and Southeast Asia at that time. So, okay, so dragon brain in pre-Tang sources. When did the term dragon brain appear in Chinese sources? Why dragon brain, referring to camphor? There's two type of sources I identified. The earliest mention of this term actually appeared in the pre-Tang Buddhist texts. This is early 5th century text, the treatise on the great perfection of wisdom, Dazhi Lulun, attributed to Nagarjuna and translated by the Central Asian monk Kumarajiva. Right? So, and this is basic text in the Mahayana tradition, and it refers to camphor brain as the origin for the dragon pearl. Dragon brain, origin for dragon pearl. This is Sintamani. It's for those of you who do Buddhist studies, this is a magical object with omnipotent power of eliminating illnesses, such as eliminating 404 illnesses in Buddhist terms, protecting one from dangers, bring fortunes, etc., etc. So that's one imagination of the dragon brain's power is in the Buddhist context, possessing magical power. And less than a century later, from in the medical text, we do see the dragon brain pop up again in this Materia Medica text compiled by the medical compiler, alchemist, Taoist master Tao Hongjing toward the end of the 5th century. And so in this Materia Medica text, he put camphor or dragon brain in the category of dragon bone, which refers to a fossilized animal bone. And Tao says that dragon brain actually is what remains after dragon molts, and its texture is fatty and soft, and it is particularly useful to treat the dysentery, a particular illness associated with dragon brain. So you can see that in both contexts, Buddhist context, medical context, whether it's all-powerful, or specific illness to treat, there's no association of aroma with it, right? So, and when did that happen, right? So the combination of two terms, dragon brain and aromatic, when they come together, it first appears in the 7th century sources. This is a court dynastic history, Sui Shu, history of Sui, referring to this item. This is definitely a foreign item imported from a country called, kingdom called Red Earth, likely located in southern Malay Peninsula, and imported into the court of Sui in early 7th century as a gift of that kingdom, along with other aromatics growing in that part of the world, right? So that's definitely referring to a new substance from a faraway place in Southeast Asia. So other channels besides this kind of diplomatic exchange, Buddhist transmission play a very important role. Here I want to refer back to a text that Yunhe actually mentioned yesterday, Great Tang Records on the Western regions in the 7th century. This is by the famous Chinese monk Xuanzang, who traveled to India and spent 17 years there, acquired Buddhist learning, and he did in his record talk about the natural habitats of a variety of plants, aromatics, and one of this is his itinerary. And one thing I want to mention is that Yunhe mentioned that so this is based on the eyewitness experience of Xuanzang. For most of the places he did visit himself, but there are places he didn't reach, including Persia, including some Southeast Asian kingdoms, as well as this particular place named right, Malakuta. So he didn't reach there, but he acquired some information from second-hand channel. And based on that information, there are two kinds of trees growing in the mountainous areas of that kingdom. One is sandalwood, hanxiang, and the other is called jiebuluoxiang, kapula, right? So which is a Sanskrit word. This is a transliteration of that. I think kapula is the Sanskrit word for camphor, which gives rise to a variety of European languages for camphor today. And I think Brian mentioned the Mongolian word for camphor yesterday briefly. I would like to hear more about that connection as well. So this, based on this geographical information given by Xuanzang, is unlikely referring to the camphor from Southeast Asia. This is the Malabar camphor I referred to early on. But for Xuanzang, he used the same term, dragon brain aromatic, to refer to this substance. So trade is another channel. Quite a few of you mentioned that in your talks yesterday. And here I want to give a suggestive evidence from early source. We know that this is no stranger to this audience. Sogdians play a quite important role in trading commodities across the overland Silk Roads from the 3rd to the 9th century. And Miranda will talk more about Sogdians, their role in introducing, dietary products, I think. So they are the Eastern Iranian people centered on the Samarkand. And so there's very important early documents called Sogdian Asian letters dating to the early 4th century. That's quite early on. And including this kind of letter exchanges between the merchants, Sogdian merchants acting in China, and people in the homeland, Samarkand, right? So one particular letter, this is based on historian Bibo's study, letter 6, referring to a letter that the letter carrier, let's presumably this is prior to his trip to Lowland, which is in modern Xinjiang area, he is asked to purchase some silk in the Chinese market. And if silk is not available, get some, this term is a Sogdian term. I don't read Sogdian. If anybody reads Sogdian, I would like to talk to you about this term. According to B-Boys, I like to refer to camphor. We don't know which kind of camphor, right? This is corresponding to a Sanskrit word, kapura, whether it's from South Indian or Southeast Asia, we don't know for sure. And based on this evidence, camphor was already available in its early time in Chinese market, and obviously a valuable commodity for Sogdians. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of my time on the particular area of healing in use of camphor in healing Tang period time. So this is an important pharmacological text in mid-7th century. This is the first court-sponsored pharmacopeia in Chinese history, compiled by more than 20 officials, medical writers at the Tang court. It includes 850 drug items. 11 of these drugs are newly added drugs from faraway places, aromatics. So I don't have time to go over all of them. I just want to highlight the inclusion of camphor here. Dragon brain, the first time it appears in the pharmacological text. And you can see the location, the origin of camphor is very clearly specified as Polü, which likely refer to Baras kingdom located in the western region of Sumatra. So what does camphor do in this text? So it does things, I mean, the recognition of its fragrance in this medical text is quite obvious. And it could replace that of the dragon brain. The second one possibly referred to the dragon brain in earlier Materia medical texts, a local product associated with the dragon bone. But here the fragrance was highlighted, right, for this particular foreign product. It expelled malignant qi, dispersed food, dissipated abdominal distension, sent one smiles. So associated with this fragrance somewhat. And I find this passage interesting because it resembles to a certain degree a passage from an earlier text of Ayurvedic medicine dating to 3rd or 4th century. This is the Sutta Samhita, right? So here you can read the passage, right? After a meal, one should take in, the aromatics such as, the betel leaves with areca nuts, camphor, nutmeg, a clove, either by smoking, by means of anything that instantaneously removes the acidity in the cavity of the mouth and permeates it with its own essence. So I do see some resemblance here, indicating that this kind of value associated with the fragrance of the dragon brain came from Indian. Other passage in this item of dragon brain aromatic uses characteristic indigenous medical terms, such as the qi in the heart and abdomen, wind dam accumulations. This is a local medical terms newly assigned to this new substance in the Pharmacopeia. Interestingly, it also talks about its value as brightening the eyes and eliminates redness and the screen in the eyes. So this is this is something I find quite interesting, because this kind of association to treat eye problem become more prominent in a Song period of time, if I have time to talk about it. So this is a question mark for me, whether it's local or it's from Nagarjuna healing tradition, which is very prominent Buddhist healing tradition, particularly in the area of ophthalmology. And if you remember the early Buddhist text I mentioned, Da Zhi Du Lun, actually is attributed to Nagarjuna. It's in that tradition. So whether there's a connection to that or not, it's something that awaits further research. So beyond the Materia medical text, I also investigated medical formulas. This is a massive collection of medical formulas emerging in the 8th century, compiled by the medical writer Wang Tao, who had access to the imperial library, and the medical text there. And so it's a massive text. We have not that many camphor containing formulas. I think I identified 6, but they're revealing. One of them is called 吃力加文方 formulas Formula of Tractylose pill. Tractylose is the leading ingredient in this formula, which is a local herb. But the term 直立甲烷 is certainly a transliteration of a Sanskrit term, Sanskrit word for attractive load, indicating a foreign origin of this formula. And further evidence for that is it involved the use of 9 different kinds of aromatics, most of which came from foreign places, South and Southeast Asia, including camphor. And it's supposed to treat the intractable entities. This is upon ingestion. That's one way of using this pill. Or it can be worn along the side, near the heart of the body. It requires this kind of apotropaic function to expel demonic qi. So it's interesting that author also recognized that this formula came from another formula collection called Formulas for Widespread Aid, produced by the court of the Tang in early 8th century. This is one of the few books or collections produced by the court. And by doing that, the court's effort is to disseminate these formulas by inscribing them on the stabs and establish those stabs at the major suites of the capital and the capital of the provinces to disseminate the medical knowledge to the wider populace. So this is something supposedly not just be kept in the imperial library, but with an implication of being actually used for a broader audience. Naturally, for scholars working on this period of time, the Dunhuang manuscripts remains invaluable. And we have quite a few Dunhuang experts here, so I would like to share some of my works here as well. There are more than 100 medical manuscripts broadly conceived in this massive collection, and Catherine Desper's edited volume on that still remains very important reference work. So I want to introduce 2 manuscripts. One is the Patio Chinois 3930. This is a fragmented manuscript, 8 pages, but in an interesting format that Amanda talked about different forms of Dunhuang manuscript. This is in a codex form, dating to the 10th century. It includes several dozens of formulas using simple remedies. So compared to the Wang Tao's collection, which use extensively aromatics, this is much simpler, right? So give me one example is to treat wind-induced headache. And there are a variety of remedies there, including moxibustion, formulas. One particularly formula used 4 different kinds of aromatics: patchouli, saffron, camphor oil, and sesame oil, making into the ointment, and that can treat this particular condition. So this kind of simple remedy we find on this manuscript. Maybe it's just a coincidence, or maybe it's not. Maybe there's some connection to the particular form of this manuscript, which is a codex form. Supposedly, is easy to carry and use, right? So it's like this big manuscript. The second manuscript I'd like to introduce is of a different type. This is also in the Paleo Chinois collection. This is a fragmented manuscript. Dating is pretty hard. It includes a number of formula or recipes in the broadly conceived the tradition of the bigu, avoiding the grain, this kind of Taoist tradition of fasting, actually, to cure illness, to prolong life. One particular formula prescribes a camphor-containing recipe for treating gu poison. So gu poison is a unique local serious conditions. Often appears in Chinese sources, medical and beyond, which basically is a condition induced by the preparation, a magical preparation of vermin, right? So, which create great anxiety at the society at the time. So I talk about this actually in my first book. So this is also a relatively simple remedy, including 3 ingredients. One is the fermented bean, and the second one is the yellow dragon brain. This is a very unique term I only see on this Dunhuang manuscript, nowhere else, actually, yellow dragon brain, that combination. I see white dragon brain quite a lot in the medical sources, but not yellow dragon brain. That's a very interesting thing, perhaps a local variant term, I don't know. and then together with the oven earth. And upon ingestion, interesting, what follows is a series of spells in combination with the use of formula. 3 spells in particular. One is in vernacular language. Actually, it's translated literally as the father is the worm or vermin of the dung beetle, and the mother is the demon of Yeshua, likely a transliteration of a Sanskrit word. And the relatives, hundreds and thousands of tens of thousands. So we have some big number here. And now I now recognize all of you, right? That's basically the words here. So the implication here is use of spells, incantations, to the power of which to eliminate demonic entities, as imagined as demons and worms, out of the body. And that's one in the vernacular term, but the other 2 actually is in this tradition of esoteric Buddhism, Dharanis. Right? So basically, it's transliteration of Sanskrit words. Doesn't make much sense in Chinese, but supposedly possess the power to propitiate deities for the cure of illness. Right? So these are Dharani texts, which I found an interesting connection to another manuscript. This is a manuscript actually mentioned by Amanda in her keynote talk. This is one of those manuscripts with the Poti format. Right? It's a very large manuscript in terms of the number of pages, including a miscellaneous collection of various Dharani texts. And one of them actually is a text produced by a Buddhist Indian monk in 7th century China. It has a very long name here, so I didn't write it down. It's the Sutra on the Dharani of the vast, complete, and unobstructed great compassion of a Bodhisattva, Avalokitesvara with 1,000 hands, 1,000 eyes. So, and that Bodhisattva, I think some of you may be familiar with, it's very popular in medieval China. So there's a particular remedy here, again, involve the use of the remedy to counter gu poison, the same condition. A slightly different formula, but involves camphor as well. In this case, use the Sanskrit term, kapru, Chinese transliteration. And you see there's a glossing there saying this is dragon brain aromatic, right? That's a glossing. Together with another aromatic called Assassid aromatic. It's not probably from Assassid Empire, it's probably from Indian. And then the combination of which produce the cure, again, with the incantation, with the spells in front of this Bodhisattva. Right? So whether there is a connection between these 2, I don't know, because the dating of the first manuscript here is very hard. We know the dating of the second text, but not the manuscript, the text, is 7th century. But you can see some connections, and the first manuscript actually is hybrid of various remedies, including esoteric Buddhist healing, but also the healing using mundane substances and vernacular language. And I found that hybridity is quite interesting. So I think I do have some time for some more time, for 5 minutes. I think I can talk a little bit more about the Song period, the following 3 centuries also. So one thing that is prominent during this period of time is the increasing role of the court in sponsoring publishing in the sense of with the rise of printing and disseminating medical knowledge by producing medical texts. This has been already extensively studied by scholars like Asaf Goldsmiths, T.J. Hinrichs, and Fan Jiawei. So I want to direct your attention to 3 texts sponsored by the Song Court, published by the Song Court. One is a 10th century text called Taiping Era Formulary of Sagely Grace. It's a massive collection of 17,000 formulas. And second one is even larger, produced in the early 12th century, comprehensive record of sagely benevolence, 20,000. And third one is with a smaller scale, but no less significant. This is a formulary of the pharmacy service for great peace and for the benefit of people. So pharmacy service, this is a newly established institution by the Song Court to prescribe and disseminate these preset formulas for the populace. So it includes about 800 formulas there. And you can see that there is expansion of containing formulas during the Song period time. So you can see that in the first text is Tang text I mentioned early on, the 8th century text, only 6 formulas, so 0.1%, very small percentage. But now in the Song period time, you see 1.5% to 5% So in terms of the number, hundreds of formulas involving camphor and other aromatics. Right? So again, I need to be cautioned here because these song texts, particularly the second and third one, often is a copying of earlier medical formulas, though they might not be entirely a Song invention. It could be something in the preceding centuries, at least after the 8th century, after the first text, you have this explosion of the aromatic camphor-containing formulas, and they are used in various categories of healing, particularly in 3 categories: wind-induced illnesses, I talked about that before, eye problems, I also talked about that before, and pediatric disorders, something new during this period of time. I need to investigate that as well. But I want to bring the conversation back to the issue of smell, the idea of using camphor to eliminate the body odor. We find that in a few formulas, not in great quantity. So this comes back to this connection between camphor and broccoli aromatics and the role of smell in healing. I want to finally bring this text to your attention. This is a 12th century text by Kozong Shi, named Dilations on Materia Medica. This is not a government-sponsored text. This is a text written by this medical writer who had access to some of the resources at the government and worked together with the government. And he has some unique interpretation of the property of the drugs, like 4T, that's a degree of degree of hotness. He would say that's not the right word for these conditions. Instead, the 4T refers to 4 different kinds of smells: fragrant, stinky, rancid, bloody. This is the first time a medical writer make that claim. Right? So in the case of camphor, the smell is emphasized in this text. It's pure fragrance surpasses those of 100 medicines, and particularly useful to treat heat-induced congestion in the body. So it's not, at least explicitly, through the smell, but through the cooling property of camphor, which is very obvious in many other remedies that treat heat-induced congestion in the body. But also beyond the medicine, he described that among myriad things, nothing's fragrance is superior to this one, and particularly have implication to add it into the tea. But not too much of it could mask the smell of the tea. So there is an implication of the use of that in food. So I want to just conclude with my preliminary research on this case study. When you think about the local adaptation of knowledge, particularly knowledge of healing, right? So we find that, that when camphor is introduced into China, into Chinese medicine, in quite a variety of virtues. Sometimes this is knowledge imported from India, and sometimes this is the knowledge kind of incorporated into the local medical system to treat particular conditions like food poisoning in China, and oftentimes in combination with other ritual, healing techniques such as, spells, right? So, and the role of Buddhism obviously is quite important in circulating the knowledge of healing using aromatics. Monks involved, in transmitting knowledge. Also, particularly in the domain of esoteric Buddhism, there's a very strong tradition, especially during the Tang period of time, this elaborate use of aromatics, including camphor, not just to treat illnesses, but also to use as a ritual substance to invoke the power of the deity. Right? So, and burning incense is a big part of that story, which finally come back to this issue of smell. We know smell figure very prominently in the culture of burning incense, and including in the Buddhist tradition. And oftentimes in that particular area, smell didn't work by itself. It often operates with other kind of senses, such as auditory effects of incantations and visual effect of libations or anointments of statues. So it's not just smell itself, but it's sensorium or intersensoriality that enhance the bodily experience of a devotee. In the domain of healing, we find some suggestive evidence of the smell there, although it's often worked together with the local categories such as the healing and cooling property of drugs to make it work. And obviously, it also have some interesting connection to food culture, which you find, especially in the Song period of time, that witness the rising of consumer culture in urban spaces with the very massive consumption of these substances, which is a topic that certainly requires further research. So with that, I want to conclude my talk, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Miranda Brown, Arthur F. Thurnau, professor of Chinese Studies in the Asian Languages and Cultures Department at University of Michigan's prestigious College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. She is the author of 3 books. First, The Politics of Mourning in Early China from 2007, and with the late Conrad Schirokauer, co-author of A Brief History of Chinese Civilization that came out in 2012. Her most recent book from 2015, The Art of Medicine in Early China, The Ancient and Medieval Origins of a Modern Archive, is a really interesting take on, among other things, medical progenitors and the sort of narrative tradition of Chinese medicine. It's how it incorporates forms of Chinese knowledge production. Her current project, as I understand it, is a history of dairy in China before the 20th century, a topic that has received scant attention in the West. And it seems that she's already published on this topic, and we're going to hear more about it today.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me? Great. Hello, thank you for listening, and I want to thank the organizers and also that wonderful sort of introduction. So I am going to be talking about something that I don't know that much about, so am I too loud? I am from California. All right. I'll start with a little vignette about Tang Taizong. Rich and poor may eat differently, but upset stomachs beset all. The second emperor of the Tang Dynasty of China, Taizong, found himself in just such a predicament one day. His belly had swollen, and stool leaked out uncontrollably from it. The palace physicians were able to diagnose his body as having been infiltrated by a cold qi, but they could not treat the loose stool, which had turned an alarming red and white color in time for our lunch, of course. At a loss, the palace issued a call to all local physicians to render assistance, and it was answered by an old magistrate named Zhang Guocang. Zhang, however, was not a doctor, but he had suffered from the same condition years before, and he knew what to do. So he recommended that palace attendants boil milk with long Indian peppers, bi bo. Prepared and administered, the simple decoction reportedly stopped the emperor's diarrhea after just a few sips. Lovely image, right? And of course, super fragrant. Okay, so obviously the story raises a number of questions, and I'll stop reading. It does, of course, sound like a piece of fiction, right? And not a particularly plausible one. I mean, the last time I got the runs, I didn't drink milk, especially condensed milk with long peppers, you know. So that actually, I think, sounds like a poor combination, but surprisingly enough, this is actually on the books in Chinese Pharmacopeia all the way up until the early 20th century. There are reports of a related formula being used to treat dysentery in colonial Taiwan. So we know this is around for quite a bit of time. Now, I have discussed it in sort of other contexts, so I'll just kind of give you a nod about how we could read this. Clearly, it's a sort of this question of taking milk from the runs is interesting if you are invested in the myth that Asians are lactose intolerant. And this is a project that I am working currently with my former student, Alice Yao, who's now tenured professor at the University of Chicago, and it's a project called The Whiteness of Milk, or The Whitening of Milk. And then also, it's part of my larger, I'm interested in the medical uses of dairy in this sort of other project, which is about sort of dairy in the Yangtze Delta in the early modern period, and that's called The Forgotten Delicacy. It's a project that eventually will get done, I hope. But today I want to talk about this story from a different angle, and I'm actually more interested in how milk becomes really a sort of a staple of the pharmacological tradition in medieval and early modern China. One thing you know is that if you do a search on dairy products in Chinese Pharmacopeia, you'll find tens of thousands of references to them. Some of them are for things like yogurt and butter, but others are just for good old cow's milk, boiled down into some decoction. So my question today is, how did it become an important ingredient? And I'm going to talk about some of the context in a moment. So I'll give you sort of the brief discussion of milk in the sort of early medieval context, and I'll talk about the explosion, just to kind of run off this lovely sort of, gastric distress metaphor, this explosion in medieval medicine. And then I want to think about how this happened, and here I'm going to need your help because I only read classical Chinese, and I always joke barely, but I'm going to need some help from people who know Central Asian languages and something about Buddhist medicine. Okay, so just some context. Milk obviously is not something China is famous for, but it goes back quite a bit into Chinese history. We now have archaeological evidence that we're pushing up against 3,000 years. There are sort of recently a lipid analysis was performed by Yang Yiming at the Chinese Academy of Science with a large team in the northern state of Rui during the spring and autumn period. So think of like North China, Yellow River Valley. This is an area that's kind of like a transitional zone between agriculture and pastoralism. But the archaeologists were able to determine that ordinary people were drinking milk of some kind. Sheep, probably goats, maybe probably yaks, since that's the thing now. Also, there's evidence of limited kumis consumption. It's a popular food, actually, after the opening of the Silk Roads in the Western Han. The Han Emperor Wu Di actually has a bureau that keeps him and his officials stocked with kumis. Obviously, this is a sort of reflection of the sort of encounters with the Dominic world and the Xiongnu in particular. But we do know that there's, some kind of dairy, not just in the diet, but in other contexts as well. So let me just give you some other context. Now, I promised at least one photograph for Rob here. This is actually a Eastern Han sort of picture from, I think it's from Shanxi, a tomb mural. It's an area that's close to the Gloriate Wall. You can see the sort of conversation of nomadicism happening. They're clearly drinking the stuff. If you can see at the very end of your, I guess it would be your left, somebody offering the milk to the lord of the manor, and then you can see someone trying to milk a horse. Yeah. Do not try that at home, okay. The larger context is missing, but we know that, there is some milk, especially in areas where, you have ruminants and knowledge of animal husbandry, right, surprisingly enough. And notice that they're not processing the milk and they're taking it straight, so people often say, well, how do you know they don't know that they're lactose intolerant? And I'm like, if you're going to have the runs after milk, you don't need a PhD to figure that out. Yeah. Now, we also know that there's a lot of dairy, in the medieval period. North China gets depopulated at the end of Han, right? Nomadic peoples move in. Some of them, of course, are very sort of, Iranians potentially, obviously various kinds of Mongolian populations, Tibetans, Turks, and so forth. But we know that goats and sheep are very important in the early medieval Chinese diet. This is, of course, the very famous sort of yogurt product that's been dried. I call them dried milk balls. It's rather divisive, but it's something that actually filters into the Chinese world in this sort of 5th or 6th century, very common. Very good way of actually taking seasonal surpluses and making it into a long-term product, that can literally last for years, even though it gets a little sort of musky after, 4, 5, or 6 years. Now, why I bring this up is that one of the things that we know with sort of early Chinese sources is that, cows are not particularly important in sort of like, the daily life of nomads. I mean, goats and sheep are actually, and camels and yaks are actually better featured. So I want just to kind of raise the issue of what kinds of milk, are being used, because I think they offer clues, at least when you get to the medieval period and medicine, okay? Now, Milk is not heavily sort of featured in sort of early Chinese pharmacopoeia. There's a couple references potentially in Malongdui, all topical. I believe there isn't any references in Lao Guanshan, which is this important set of documents that were published recently from Sichuan, from Chengdu. And when we get to sort of the later Han, you get to the Wu Wei manuscripts, which is from basically Gansu, so the very sort of eastern edge of the sort of Silk Road, I guess, in some sense. You have one reference to camel butter that's used topically for horseback riding sort of wounds, and so the picture is actually from that source, which I translated with Yang Yong in 2017. But cow's milk is not sort of present in any of these sources, or at least not explicitly. And I just want to mention that. Now, we have to kind of go into the medieval period before we really get much cow's milk initially. We get a few things, in Gehong, and I think my slides might be out of order, but by the time we get to Sun Simiao, we have, a lot of references to cow's milk, in particular being sort of referenced in various sort of forms, both as sort of a healthy food for the elderly and people with weak stomachs, but also as a drug for a wide variety of conditions, which I will elaborate on shortly. And this is just really the beginning of what you'll see. But just as you mentioned, the first reference is actually Gehong. There's a couple of references to goat milk, cow's milk. This is a reconstructed text from the 4th century, so we're not 100% sure how to weigh this evidence, but it's just getting started. Some people think he's, obviously a crypto-Buddhist. No comment. Okay, so let me give you some examples of how milk is used. This is actually from Sun Simiao. So this is a, typical drug. You take some, heavy metals, some sulfur, and make some powder from it. Then you add 5 sheng of cow's milk, about 4 and some cups, You cook it with some spring water, you get some heavy metals, you add more sulfur, and then you boil it down and you take the drug with milk, okay? Now, what's actually interesting about Sun Simiao is that you take a lot of drugs with milk, as well as using milk as a medicine. And this is actually quite different from the early period where often you're downing things with rice beer, So milk is heavily featured. And then from Sun Simiao, this sort of dam breaks, to get into the runny metaphors again. You have many, many sort of drugs with milk. So I'll just kind of highlight some of the highlights. So you can use milk for just about everything. And this is mostly cow's milk. Fertility problems in women, gray hair, which I have a lot of now. Stamina issues for men, clearly a fascination for sort of Chinese doctors. Pesky grays, depletion, diabetes. Actually today, Chinese medical doctors will prescribe goat's yogurt for diabetes. You can mix it with peach pits, butter, honey, and that will fix frailty in people. It's good as a postpartum drug. So all of these are, potential medical uses of milk. The list goes on. So most often you take the milk in an oral form. You use it as like water to down your drugs or your pills, right? You can add it to a medicinal soup. Usually you're going to be condensing it. And you can use it for things like alcoholism. Now this is one of my favorite drugs of all time. And this is not cow's milk, but it's something else. So if you have a problem with drinking, you take the milk of a white pig and drink. And that will cure your love of booze. It's appealing, right? Okay. Also, you have lots and lots of this stuff in Sun Simiao's formulary, and they come from various sources. Now, I want to highlight a few things, which is that dogs' milk comes up in a couple of cases, just 2, donkeys 4, pigs 4, sheep and goats 12. And this is interesting because, the Tang, of course, is, part Xinbei, nomadic. You would think sheep's milk would be more prominently sort of featured if we're just dealing with the cultural backgrounds of our rulers, but nope. Human breast milk, which I think has gotten way too much attention, in the history of medicine, mostly because it reinforces the idea of the pervy Chinese. But that is, a fraction of what I think is really the main sort of milk sort of product in the formulary, which is cow's milk. So I want to kind of focus on that cow's milk and why this is so prominently featured, right? So 37, okay? It's also used, it's used a lot, mostly for its therapeutic properties. I'll go over those. Cow's milk is considered not the great Satan of food like it is today, especially in California, but actually this wonder food or elixir, right? Replenishes those suffering from vacuity or feebleness and stops thirst, right? And then sheep's milk has a different sort of like healing profile. It restores those suffering from cold and deficiency and heats a person within. Go figure, right? And then I also want to highlight the fact that butter is supposed to be good for your lungs. And that ghee adds years to the lifespan. Don't talk to my cardiologist. Okay. Okay, so let me just get back to the story of this weird formula, right? With cow's milk boiled down with this long pepper, right, to fix chronic diarrhea. Does that, and the question of where this comes from, because I think it offers clues about sort of the explosion of milky medicines in the Chinese context. So the long black pepper is no surprises. It's not a native Chinese plant, right? It's from northern India or central India. This term bi bo is an obvious loan word, right? It's, I think, an attempt to transliterate Papalis, right, which is from South Asia. And not surprisingly, this drug, milk and long pepper, is a very Ayurvedic, sort of like formula. You still see it today in South Asia for a wide variety of conditions. So oddly enough, not chronic dysentery. This kind of drug screams Buddhist medicine, right, in the most obvious ways. This is not terribly surprising in the case of Sun Simiao, who, I think is very open or, explicit about his debt to Buddhist medicine, which is all over medieval China. And we know from other works, for example, by Fan Jiawei, that, the Chinese learned about things like cataract surgery, right? And we also know, of course, that in South Asia, in the Ayurvedic tradition, cow's milk is really in some ways a magical food and medicine, right? So to borrow some unpaid labor, uncompensated labor, to use their sort of jargon of the era, I sort of tapped a colleague, Dave Brick, to do some translation for me, to find sort of entries on milk in sort of these, sort of classical Sanskrit texts. And here you have, of course, a passage that basically shows up in the Chinese, which is milk is said to be the greatest of vivifying substances, the elixir of life, right? So cow's milk is, I think, especially sort of important in the Buddhist and South Asian tradition. Okay, so here's the part that I want the help from. So I am, somebody that's increasingly interested in how things travel. I think the fact that there is influence is not shocking to me, but I want to know who brought it and how it came, because I think you can't just assume that an idea moves just because, it's there, right? Or that people naturally want to share or can share ideas, especially when you're, separated by things like deserts and borders and language barriers. So the question of how. This is a picture from the Dunhuang caves, you probably all recognize. This is a sort of a depiction from the life of the Buddha, I think. This is actually an illustration of one of the sutras of the sort of the path to nirvana, which highlights sort of the, compares the attainment of nirvana to the process of turning cow's milk into ghee or clarified butter. It's depicted here quite beautifully. So we suspect that there's a Buddhist connection, but I want to focus on the question of who brought it, right? Because I think that's always something we should ask ourselves, and especially since it gets to China pretty early in the sort of first half of the medieval period. So I want to go back to this lovely story of milk for the runs and kind of zero in on a few details, namely the formula itself, right? So one thing about the story is that if you do a search of the drugs or the combination of the drugs, it actually leads you to other sort of texts and contexts. So here I'm going to show you something from the Qianjin Yifang, also attributed to Sun Simiao, but whatever. I'm always, suspicious of texts that are attributed to people who live well over 100 years, right? Which are cribbed off of other texts. But here he has another, reference to, taking cow's milk to, replenish, vacuity, right, and sort of, and various other things. And here you take a lot of cow's milk and then you, mix it with the pipalis or the bibo, right, which has been strained. And I think this is something that I'm very, very interested in because, not surprisingly, in this passage there is actually a reference to the source of the formula, which I didn't actually have to do myself. myself. So one of the, this Chenjin Yifan compiler cites this other guy, Mr. Zhang, who says that this formula is actually very popular in, in this Iranian world, Bosa, Persia, perhaps, right? And then Daqin, and here I want to sort of ask you guys, because I know that technically translates as Rome or the Eastern, Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, but my feelings, I've seen it somewhere that it could also reference, the sort of Iranian parts of the Silk Road. So, yes, that works even better for my case. Thank you. And it basically says that these people, these Iranian speakers, really value this formula, right? And I'm like, wait a minute, why are Iranians pushing an Ayurvedic cure? And it's that slippage that I find very interesting, right? And these guys refer to it as somehow as dispelling sort of bad things, decoction that dispels bad things. So this is what I want to push on, is that sort of Iranian connection, the way that an Indian drug is now associated with, an Indian drug is associated with Iranians in China. Okay. So why, right? How is that sort of conflation going? Obviously I don't read anything, barely speak English on some days of the week. But I think what's interesting to me, though, is that just looking at the secondary literature and looking at all the works by people who are far more erudite than I am, is that you see actually a lot of references to sort of Iranian, Persians and Sogdians probably bringing things from India. Not surprising, since they were some of the first missionaries to China in the early medieval period. But here you have a reference to a passage that Chunming, that famous Beda professor, translated, that's attributed to a fellow named Huilin, who's a Buddhist monk, obviously. And here they have this Bi-Bo is actually associated with the West, Persia, and the Brahminical country. So I'm thinking, why is India and Persia being conflated? Just something to think about, right? That sort of that perception of it being associated with this group of people. And then he describes it. It looks like mulberry. It's thin, it's long, and very acrid. To me, actually, it looks more like an elongated miniature pine cone, but to each it's their own. And then, we also know that, so in terms of dairy sort of based drugs with cow's milk, this is something that's clearly sort of, in the sort of mix at places like Huang and the Sogdian archives, which I cannot read. And so the Sogdians, who are important, in sort of transmitting Buddhism in the early phases, are also, I think, sort of, clearly, in some of these little fragments, writing down medical texts, translating between traditions, but one of the traditions that they're translating and working with are, of course, clearly sort of Ayurvedic. Not surprising, since they, sort of monopolized the trade with India. And this is something that the scholar Bi-Bo has sort of pointed out in her sort of study of Sogdian medicine from Huang. So, and then also we have other sources, another fragment that actually sort of gives us both Pipali and also cow's milk. So unfortunately, this manuscript, this is one that was Bi-Bo worked on, that's in the background. I can't read it, and it's not showing very clearly. But let me give you another one. So one of my favorite sort of Chinese medicine, sort of Dunhuang medicine sort of formulas is something from Turfan from the 8th to the 11th century, written in Sogdian. It's probably inspired by Indian medicine. It's a drug that makes you a virgin again. I know, lovely, right? And what's really interesting about it is that, obviously it's things that you put in, where, but one of the things that you put in there is ghee. So clearly they're playing with a lot of dairy, and they're also playing with pipalis, and this has made me wonder if they are involved in bringing, these amazing sort of milky medicines to early medieval China. So clearly we're working with a lot of fragments, or a few fragments. I mean, the Sogdian medical manuscripts, from what I can see, is not vast, but in general, in sort of early sort of studies, which is where I sort of fled from, we often deal with just tiny pieces of stuff, right? But I'm sort of interested in hearing how I can piece together to think about, the role that, sort of Iranians, Sogdians, and Iranians, sort of played in sort of bringing drugs, from India, or drug traditions from India into the Chinese world, and then thinking about why they're so effective. And I'll tell you the reason why I'm interested is that, I think it's important to think about how things move, right? And I say this as someone who works from the history of food, right? One of the things I've learned from, being in conversation with people like Jean Anderson is that, food culture has mostly moved, from from west to east and not the other way around in the medieval period in terms of actual sort of recipes. And I've been very curious about this, and now I've been thinking a lot about the role that sort of Iranian and Sogdian immigration played in that transmission, right? When a large number of people have a foothold into a country and keep coming, that I think has, and really penetrate into society, that has, I think, a tendency to change not only what people believe, but what they eat and what sort of substances they use to treat themselves. And I think of like transmission as less of sort of a sailor gets off a boat and meets somebody and then goes home. I don't think that's how it happens. So I want to think about the social context of transmission because, I think this is, a key sort of story that I think needs to be told, more carefully in the history of medicine and probably food. And then I also want to think about, the role that the sort of slippage between, this is an Indian drug, it's an Ayurvedic tradition, but why in China does it look, either Iranian or Sogdian to the Chinese, right? And I think it has a lot to do with who's bringing stuff and who they're in conversation with. And then, I would just also sort of put out a plea as an overwhelmed sort of mommy and generally disorganized person. If you know of any additional resources in languages I cannot read, I'd really appreciate the help. And I will stop here.
Thank you, both of our presenters already for very rich presentations, and Miranda did help make up for my bad timekeeping, and we're back to having some time for questions. So I will now invite up Sean Bradley, who is a licensed naturopathic physician and East Asian medical practitioner. He specializes in sports medicine and works primarily with professional athletes. He also runs a dojo. But he has degrees in botany, Chinese medicine, naturopathic medicine, and a PhD in Asian languages from the University of Washington, where his research focused on the transfer on early Chinese medical texts and transfer of medicine along the Silk Road. He has maintained a very active research agenda, and a sampling of his publications are Myrrh, Medical Knowledge from Arabia into Chinese Materia Medica, that's from 2018. And one that caught my eye was Sinology in Seattle, the University of Washington and its influence on the study of Chinese medicine. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from Sean.
Thank you, Sanjot, Frank, and everyone at the Town Center for Silk Road Studies. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to share my research. And I was just saying that I've never seen a panel or been part of a panel that is going to overlap and kind of come together as a cohesive whole from three presenters that have not met each other before, like this one's going to. They've pretty much introduced all the texts that I'm going to touch on, so it's kind of nice. As Stacey just mentioned, I have a very unconventional career path. Well, I started my studies in botany and then continued in the practice of naturopathic medicine, went back and earned my PhD in Asian languages and literature, and still run that full-time practice. So my original plan for this talk was to go through several case studies, but as you've seen with our two previous presenters, doing one is kind of enough. And I was going to look at several non-Chinese drugs and explore their inclusion in Chinese medicine in the form of formulas or recipes. And I'd done a couple case studies on myrrh and awe, asafoetida in the past. And as I got to halila, which is myrobalans, I kind of went down a rabbit hole and got stuck on just one. I'm going to focus mostly on the exchange between Indian and Chinese medical traditions because that's my area of study, and it's also part of my clinical bias in that you have two major traditions of Ayurvedic medicine and traditional Chinese medicine that are still used by millions of people today, and the concepts that they still use are found in these ancient texts. There's vast differences, but they still have some influence in today's world, in today's modern medicine. So of the few I've listed here, the one that I'm going to focus on is halila, which is one of three Indian medicines or myrobalans that made their way into Chinese medicine. I'll spend most of my time talking about the first one, but there are two other important myrobalans that are used medicinally as well. Their story largely mirrors the first one, And these are the three, the Chinese name and the Sanskrit name is listed there. And there's some superficial similarities in the names, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into that. Both of Miranda and Yana both touched on how the name exchange and how the transcriptions are borrowed from Sanskrit or other languages into Chinese, and I'll geek out a little bit and go down that linguistic hole for a moment. So we'll start with terminalia chibula, which is the cherubic myrabalin. And the cherubic or black myrabalin is native to the Indian subcontinent or Southeast Asia. There may be some areas that it naturally grew in China, but it's currently cultivated widely, so it's really hard to pinpoint where its native distribution actually is. But it was definitely in the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. It's a tree that grows up to 100 feet tall, and the fruit is, and which is what is primarily used in medicine, is a drupe, which is similar to like a date. In Sanskrit, it's known as haritaki. It has a lot of other names, If anybody who works in Sanskrit medical terminology, there are, I believe, around 30, 40, probably more names for myrabalin in Sanskrit. But the major one is haritaki, and then two other ones are abhyaha and amrita. And while identifying these plants is often a nightmare, the sources that I looked at all really came down to that same identification of terminalia chibula. That's not always the case, and it's often a nightmare to try and figure out plant identification. And even this one, there's going to be some challenges to which plants correspond with it. So in the Charaka Samhita, one of the earliest and most important Indian medicine texts, somewhere between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century CE, Charaka says haritaki is one of the most useful fruits, and it has a wholesome effect. As you can see, it's basically a panacea. And the major areas, though, are treating digestion, skin diseases, and eruptions, upper respiratory pathologies, and urinary disease, as well as treating issues accompanying aging and relate to longevity. One of the most notable formulas containing cherubic myrabalin is a base formula preparation that combines it with two other myrabalins mentioned previously. The combination is called Triphala, and it has a number of uses, again, including rejuvenation, treating urinary disorders, digestive problems, skin pathologies, cough, and heart disease. And the formula for Triphala, Rasayana, we have a very simple preparation, but an overall increase in health and longevity is pretty significant. Helping someone live 100 years and being free of disease seems pretty appealing. There are various other formulas here, just for haritaki. One example of formula combines it with ginger and long pepper, and that decreases gas. So maybe if we took it with milk, it might help even more. Additional formulas that include Triphala are also mentioned in the other major Ayurvedic texts, such as Sushruta Samhita and Ashtanga Hridra Samhita. And these really echo what we see in Charaka. They're pretty much across these three texts, these major indications pop up over and over and over again. I could spend a lot more time looking through the Sanskrit text, but my area of expertise is Chinese medicine, and kind of dive into that medical literature. And we'll do it the same way. We'll look at the modern identification, and again, we luck out where pretty much everyone agrees that terminalia chibula is what this plant is. Halila is the Chinese name, and just as with the Sanskrit, there's a couple other names. Hezi is one of the most common ones. And we also get some character substitutions, especially in Li Shizhen's Ben Sao Gangmu, he substitutes a different Li out. Fortunately, this doesn't make a mess of things, which sometimes character substitutions really create problems with identification and lead to different plant names as well. But this one actually wasn't that bad. And this is where I'll really dive into the humanities side of things. And when we look at the modern names, it's close enough to show that it's related. But the actual details are a lot more nuanced. Anyone who studies Chinese knows that the language has changed significantly over time, over the centuries, and the field of Chinese historical phonology is really quite complicated. These charts are a bit of a mess, But to pull out the information that we want, it's not too bad. The top chart has several of the major reconstructions from notable scholars who have worked in this field. And the two here are from South Coblin's work on Old Northwest Chinese and Buddhist transcription dialects. And for our purposes, they're the most relevant. The Buddhist transcription dialects, the first two syllables match pretty clearly, but the third one we get a little bit more problematic and as we get Hari-rak. The second chart, if we look at the second one, it gives us some of these reconstructions and it dates them. It shows where the dates, where this distribution is and where they would have been pronounced. And the most relevant one is here, where we have reference to a possible, intervocalic indic retroflex, which one of the transcriptions for Dharam Raksa, who was approximately 280 CE, transcribes la as dak, which is very close to Hari-rak. So if we were to use that transcription, it's going to match up pretty well. And what's interesting about this is that if we're to do that, we have to push our timeline for Halila being incorporated into Chinese medicine forward, or we have to add intermediary steps. And both of those are possible. And what I'm going to show in a minute is how both of those possibilities are very valid. But if we didn't look at this information, if we didn't look at the phonology, there would be really no reason to look back further because the information of transfer seems to be from the West. But if we push it back a little bit, well, we might have to go back into earlier texts. So it's early introduction into China. For most of these texts, usually you start with Li Shih-shan and the Ben Sao Gangmu, which is way in the 16th century, but it's a great starting point to see which text to look back at. And he puts the incorporation of cherubic myrobalan in the Chinese Materia Medica in the Tang Ben Sao, or the Xinqiu Ben Sao, published in 659. We'd assume it goes back further, and we don't have to look very far to find its inclusion in the Nangfang Caomuzhuang. This text is quite problematic in dating, but it fits with our purposes here, and it puts it at around 304. To go back a little bit further, though, we're going to go into the medical literature itself, the specific medical texts, and what we find is there's a mention of Halila in Zhang Zhongjing's Han Dynasty text, the Jingui Yaola, essential formulary from the Golden Cabinet, and this is where we find the first reference for Halila in the Chinese medical literature. There are two formulas in Zhang Zhongjing's text. The first is a single powder. It's taken with kanji, treat digestive problems, seems to be our theme today, such as vomiting and diarrhea. The second is a pill that's used for difficult cases. Myrobalan is combined with chunpi or orange peel, and also huopo, which is magnolia tree bark. Both are major Chinese medicinals that are used still to this day. I've got them in my pharmacy. So if we move along looking at the other formulas, its inclusion of Halila in the references mentioned earlier, Jihan in the Nanfang Caomuzhuang has a formula that seems to turn hair from white to black. Later in Sujing, as Materia Medica gives us characteristics of medicinal, the properties in Chinese medicine terminology, and the basic takeaway from this is that it works largely on digestive problems. We can look at kind of what that means, but that fullness in the chest, the cold chi, really how that would manifest would be as like reflux, and that's how we would look at that from a Chinese medicine perspective. And again, like I said, I mean, half of this presentation was already introduced with our other topics. So Sun Tzu Miao, shortly after Su Jing's Ben Sao, Sun Tzu Miao, he's the touted king of medicine from the Tang Dynasty, has formulas that also contain Halila. The first formula he has is for fullness and blockage of qi, with an inability to eat and accompanied by wheezing. His second formula, which is actually referenced in the Ben Sao Gangmu, it doesn't actually show up in his formularies, but it's referenced in the Ben Sao Gangmu, uses myrobalan as a single herb, and again, it's helping with digestion. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to touch on kind of the same thing that both Jan and Miranda talked about is the introduction of Buddhism into China has a huge effect, and especially on the medical practices. And one of the things we're exploring is how those medical practices changed and where and how it was introduced. And I Ching was one of the Chinese monks, traveled around Southeast Asia, and he has stories of things that he encountered, a lot of cultural stories of what he encountered in his travels. And he recorded this, fortunately for us, in the record of inner law sent home from the Southeast Seas. And one of the things he has in there is he laments not having access to Chinese herbs. You know, he doesn't have all of the things that he needs to stay healthy, but he does record a few of the plants that he encounters as being helpful. And he records Halila as one of the few medicines that are actually worth gathering from the West. He mentions that if you chew it every day, you can be free from disease again. And he mentions it also as part of another formula, but this kind of panacea free from all disease shows up here as well. And the formula that he has is called Sandangwan. The pill in 3 equal parts combines Halila with dried ginger and granulated sugar to make pills that treat dysentery and assist with other digestive problems. This is, again, that pattern that we see of how it's used. And with his high praise and with this panacea that's used for everything, we'd expect it to appear later in Chinese literature. And as an individual formula, the pill is interesting, but trying to find this connection into other texts would be a lot more beneficial. And I hadn't found anything for a long time until we've come to the Dunhuang manuscripts. And manuscript from the Pelliot collection 3596, an unidentified collection of remedies from between 626 and 684. And these are dated by looking at the rain dates for certain. There are certain naming taboos, so you can't use certain characters for a lot of for writing Chinese texts. So using those name taboos, they've dated into between 626 and 684, and we find Sandangwan mentioned in this text as well. And the line states, whose sideburns are black and to start with, after taking this, they will not turn white, but will actually become darker and blacker. And those who are already yellowing, take this for 60 days and it will change to black. And those who are already a white color can act as a lacquer. There's an interesting aside to that, which again, we won't have time for today, but the teeth will be firm and the tendons will also strengthen. And every 4 hours, take Sandangwan. And if we look a little bit deeper in these lines, we find a passage that's nearly identical in the Song Dynasty text, the Taiping Shanghuifang, which was mentioned previously. Again, a huge formulary with over 17,000 formulas. And if we look at them side by side, we have an unfortunate omission. But for our purposes, really, there's 2 omissions, but there's one that's missing, and the line about Sandangwan is missing. So that formula is not actually contained there. And there are a lot of possibilities of why that's the case. Some can just be translation and how it was interpreted. And normally this wouldn't, we could call it a transcription error. But what's interesting about that passage and everything around it, all of the other formulas in that section, there's 3 other formulas in that section in the Taiping Shanghuifang that also have Halila. Even though it's not contained in this formula specifically, it shows up in other formulas in that same section. So we're going to shift further along the road. Halila makes its way finally to Japan. There's a soup that appears in the 14th century, but if we go back a little bit further, in Tanbo Yasuyori's work, the Ishinpo, we have a couple of references of Halila used there as well. And those references, one of those references is from the 7th century, and it's a formulary that also has a Halila pill. And this is our formula. Again, it has indications that are very similar to what we've seen before, saying that it treats all diseases, especially digestion. And it also helps with memory and extending a person's life. For me, this is kind of what's the most interesting is about this formula is that it's really clear in its combination of using native medicinal plants. You've got It's combining it with ginseng, poria, cassia, but then it's also very clearly including other foreign substances, which bin lan is betel nut. So this is a really great example of a formula, what I would call a Silk Road formula that has pieces from all over. These plants native distribution is quite broad, and it looks like this is a nice example that shows up in the 7th century that made its way to Japan. If we circle back to the Sanskrit sources, we had the Triphala, which was a combination of the 3 myrobalans, which all 3 of them were used, and then as a base for a formula, and then also used as a formula by itself. And it was combined with the other 2. And this combination also makes its way into Chinese medicine as well. And actually, here you have the 3 fruits. And the 3 Las is the other name for it. And in the Tang and Song dynasties, this became a popular drink, and it still appears in a number of other medical works as well. As we can continue to shift into later periods, this shows up quite often. And then finally, we can't really talk about foreign drugs in China along the Silk Road without eventually coming to the Huihui Yaofang, which is the Islamic formulary, and it's much later than what we talked about before, 13th, 14th century. And the myrobalans are, as I mentioned frequently, it's mentioned frequently in this text, but the 2 formulas that stand out are in relation to what we've already talked about. And the first one addresses hair turning white and also memory. And it contains the 3 myrobalans plus frankincense, saffron, black pepper, and dried ginger. So it's clearly of a Western origin. And the second also addresses hair turning from white, and it contains a number of herbs, again, that are spread across Eurasia. But this adding of different herbs across this path is what's most interesting to me. By the time we reach the 14th century, these drugs and formulas are spread across the known world at the time. And even though their sourcing, dosing, and composition may have evolved, many of the indications still survive and point to a transfer of knowledge that continues to this day. You can actually still find Triphala at a natural food store. So from its native distribution, the cherubic myrobalan and the 2 other myrobalans traversed along the Silk Road and have been incorporated into Chinese medicine tradition. Their shared applications, such as a digestive aid to help stop cough, but also as an aid to longevity and the appearance of not aging, show that while myrobalans spread as a fruit and as a product of trade, the knowledge and the information about health and their health benefits went with it. Working its way into Chinese medicine and blending with the formulas, ingredients, and the theory there. Thank you.
So thank you. We have saved the best for second to last, I guess. But no, all panels have been excellent, and I'm sure the upcoming panel and the one after will also be extremely stimulating. This has been a great weekend so far, so thank you to the organizers and to the presenters for putting this together. This afternoon's panel, the first one is on medicine and epidemiology. The first speaker should be Christos Linteris from St. Andrews University in Scotland, where he is the chair in medical anthropology, chair and professor of medical anthropology. Our next speaker this afternoon is Ronit Yoeli-Tlalim, who is reader in history at Goldsmiths, University of London. She has recently published a very influential book called Reorienting Histories of Medicine, Encounters Along the Silk Roads, which focuses on encounters and interactions of Eurasian medicine. She writes also broadly on the history of medicine and exchanges in the history of medicine, as well as interactions. So she co-edited 4 volumes on a variety of topics, such as Rashid al-Din and his role in these interchanges, another volume on astromedicine, another one on medicine in Islam and Tibet, and Asian medicine and COVID-19, which is the latest one, I believe. Is it the latest? Yeah. So please join me in welcoming our next speaker.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, Sanjot Mahindale and Frank B.A., for organizing this wonderful conference and for inviting me. It's been a huge pleasure. I would like, and thank you, Dominic, for this kind introduction. I would like to dedicate this talk to Yoeli-Tlalim, artist and visionary, my beloved husband of 29 years who passed away 6 months ago, and without whom none of this research would have taken place. So, when the organizers of this conference first contacted me, the intended focus was medicine on the Silk Roads. I was pleased, however, to see that in its postponement, the scope of the conference had broadened to include science more generally, as well as technology. I was pleased not only because it meant I'd be able to attend, but also because it is important, as I will argue today, that these topics are discussed together. Furthermore, considering them together can shed light on one another. The focus of much of my work in the last years have been the Tibetan medical manuscripts from Don Huang. Seen in their broader context, these manuscripts provide an illuminating window into links between technology of knowledge production and medical knowledge. Through them, I've also been interested to probe questions like, how does knowledge move? Which knowledge moves easily and which moves less easily or not at all? I've discussed these questions in my recent book. I would like to make a few points on these issues here today. Thinking about nexuses of knowledge and ways in which knowledge traveled between them, we can observe what travels fast and what travels slow. Goods, tools, germs, inventions, technical skills, and ingenious solutions circulate among human groups typically faster than languages, values, traditional rituals, systems of ideas, and religious frameworks. These fast and slow transfers are also observable in the sphere of transmissions of medical knowledge. Materia Medica and its prescriptions travel easily, as we've heard today, and as Anna Akaso and myself have demonstrated for Musk, and myself on Mirabalance in the book. What traveled slow or not at all are theories behind medical practicalities. In the case of Materia Medica, the medical theory which explains why a particular drug is effective against a particular ailment, or systems of classifications of drugs, those traveled slow or not at all. We have heard, and we will hear some more later on today, about the importance of book production and also about paper. I'd like to add a few more points about paper. Paper, I would like to argue, causes us to think about knowledge produced in motion, in line with key ideas developed by historian of science Pamela Smith, with whom I was fortunate enough to work on the itineraries of materials, recipes, techniques, and knowledge across Eurasia project at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. When working on this project, we devoted much of our time thinking about relational fields. how knowledge and epistemologies are shaped by the materials and the itineraries that they follow, and how they change or are created in motion. We try to explore more broadly what types of knowledge moved easily and what types did not. We refer to the movement of these systems of knowledge, which include materials, people, practices, and ideas, as material complexes, to emphasize and probe the myriad ways in which they are intertwined. When thinking about the movement of these material complexes as itineraries over long spans of distance and time, we realized we needed to go beyond an indication of a linear movement, hence ending up with the Entangled Itineraries title for the book, which was the result of the work project and was mentioned this morning. The Entangled Itineraries term calls historians of knowledge to think beyond the linear station-to-station notion of an itinerary towards something more complex, more loopy, more messy. While Foucault made us think about how knowledge is constructed, the work of historian of science Pamela Smith more generally calls us to reflect on the materiality of knowledge production. Intertwined with the history of Eurasian knowledge transfers is the Eurasian history of technologies which enabled knowledge transfers, namely paper making and print. There is no question that the transmission of these two technologies have been revolutionary in world history. Indeed, some have suggested that the Silk Road should really be called the Paper Road. In the context of medical knowledge, we ought to consider the way paper transformed the transmission of knowledge along the Silk Roads. How, many media before Marshall McLuhan, the medium, paper in this case, affected the message. It is important, first of all, to remember the centrality of Central Asia within the history of paper-making technology. We've heard a bit about this, but I want to make a few more points. The invention of paper is traced back to China, with the year 105 of the current era often cited as the date for the inception of paper technology, though both archaeological and literary sources point to an even earlier date. An often recounted narrative locates the transmission of papermaking technology from China to the Islamic world to the Battle of Talas in 751, the famous and monumentous Chinese military defeat at the hands of the Abbasid army. One result of this Chinese defeat, so the story goes, was that 20,000 Chinese prisoners were taken by the Abbasid army with paper-making artisans among them. They settled in Samarkand and hence began the production of the famous Samarkandi paper. The Arabs learned the craft from them and soon after began manufacturing them in Baghdad. This account seems to be an oversimplification of what artifacts actually tell us. Paper was known and made in Central Asia for centuries before the Battle of Talas, and the spread of its technology west of the Pamirs was more of a gradual transmission over several routes than due to one event. What archaeology of the Silk Road has taught us is that paper and the knowledge of papermaking spread from China with Buddhism both eastwards to Korea and Japan and westwards along the Silk Roads to Central Asia. Buddhists were instrumental in transmitting paper technology across Eurasia. Papermaking was developed in these regions by Buddhist monks who were copying and translating vast numbers of religious texts. The Central Asian finds reveal not only a spread of locations, but also of time. The Dunhuang manuscripts present a succession of paper manuscripts from the 4th to the 10th century. Paper as a mobile communication device was used not only by long-distance Buddhist pilgrim monks, but also by long-distance traders. A vivid exemplar of paper usage from the 4th century are, of course, the Sogdian letters, which we've heard about today as well. Letters in Arabic on Chinese paper dating from the 8th century, which were found in Sanjar Shah, appear to be the earliest known Arabic documents written on paper. Indeed, as Haim, Shankar, and Kurbanov point out, the use of paper by Arabs in Central Asia was much more common and earlier than has been previously assumed. Soon enough, Samarkand became so well known for papermaking that the 10th century Persian geography book Hudud al-Alam, Boundaries of the World, reports as a matter of fact that Samarkand produces paper which is exported all over the world. This reputation of Samarkandi paper is perhaps what is behind an intriguing mention of paper in one of the Tibetan medical manuscripts from Dunhuang, Paleo-Tibetan 127, dating to the 9th or 10th centuries, which states, I quote, "If there is bleeding from the nose, use paper from Tajik." Tajik referring here to Islamic Central Asia. What we learn from this mention is not only that paper was used in multiple ways, but also that the author of this text was aware of different types of paper and their properties. The thin Chinese variety not so handy in case of a nosebleed. The effects of the diffusion of paper and papermaking, usually hidden in the history of science by the shadow of printing, can be observed in revolutionary changes to a great variety of realms of human knowledge production. An important one is how paper enabled the development of systems of notation and new graphic modes of thinking and documenting knowledge. While these have been discussed within the context of mathematics, astronomy, cartography, commerce, and the arts, including a fascinating example that Amanda showed us the other night, it is also very important within the context of production of medical knowledge. The early paper manuscript collections of the Silk Roads, as well as those of the Cairo Geniza, which I discuss in my book, reflect adaptations to local cultures which went hand in hand with the vernacularization of knowledge, translations to local vernaculars, transliterations, line-by-line translations, and the writing of one language in the script of another. I use the term translation with caution. Very often we are facing a wide range of adaptations, pseudo-translations, or transcreations. Other aspects of knowledge production enabled by paper are exemplified in the traces of the transmission of moxibustion techniques, using a combination of text and images, which can be traced as they moved from Chinese to Tibetan and to Uyghur contexts. Moxibustion is a form of therapeutic practice which involves the use of different tools and substances to heat the body in various locations in order to treat and prevent illness. Although it is mostly associated with Chinese, Tibetan, Korean, Japanese, and Mongolian medical systems, the practice of heating specific locations of the body to treat various ailments through the use of heated up iron, heated stones, or burning mugwort were common throughout Eurasia. In thinking about which types of medical knowledge travels easily and which not, we can see that moxibustion as a quick and easy practice traveled easily. The simple instructions found in the Tibetan and Chinese moxibustion texts from Dunhuang, as well as the Uyghur example from Turfan, exemplify how such a useful practice was easily transmittable. They include simple practical instructions in the form of, if X, when X represents some medical problem, burn Y moksas on a Z location. The locations, while explained quite clearly, for example, measure 3 finger width above the navel, are clearly benefited by illustrations, specifically text mixed with illustrations. These illustrated texts are some of the very first drawn on paper. This is the Tibetan example and the Chinese. These Tibetan and Chinese moksha cautery illustrations, both crude and practical, exemplify the ease with which such illustrations lend themselves to usage beyond learned circles. Visually depicting medical knowledge in this way facilitated the quick and easy moksha cautery practice and surfaced alongside the growing availability of paper. We can see that Moksha-bastion knowledge obviously lends itself to illustration. The black lines, go back here, the black lines connecting black dots on the anatomical figures and the concise hands-on captions may seem almost trivial to our eyes, but in fact they are not. They are some of the earliest, if not the earliest, extant examples of indication lines in anatomical illustrations, linking a realistic depiction of a human body alongside with didactic diagrammatical elements, the black dots and the indication lines. They are thus important exemplars of both knowledge construction and knowledge transmission. Though it is hard to establish the date of the earliest illustrated Akumoksa text with any accuracy, there are plenty of references to them in Chinese catalogs, as the work of my colleague Vivian Low has shown. But even within the context of the rich Chinese tradition, the earliest extant Moksha-bastion illustrations are those from Dunhuang, these Chinese ones. Along with the Chinese Moksha-bastion charts from Dunhuang and an Italian 9th century exemplar, this one, which has been dated to the 9th or 10th century, these are one of the earliest examples in the history of illustrations of the human body, representing a new way of formulating therapeutic knowledge. Another example of a similar illustrated text is an Uyghur medical text with 3 illustrations, which is drawn on the back of a Buddhist text from the German Turfan collection. This manuscript, Uyghur Mind 725, the dating of which remains unclear, includes 3 drawings of human bodies, 9 succinct descriptions of body locations, and some pharmacological recipes. Of the human bodies illustrated, 2 are depicted sitting down, and the 3rd is in a standing position. The first human figure is a very rare depiction of a woman, the one on the very left. Going by the angle of her thigh, she appears to be seated cross-legged, and going by the angle of her arm, she might have had her hands in a mudra, in a particular mudra. The indicating lines mark bodily locations with round black dots on one side, and their descriptions on the other side, on the head, on the breast, on the hand, on the knee, and on the sole of the feet. The second image appears to be male, clearly sitting in a lotus position, with the palms of his hand resting on his thighs. The ribs are clearly demarcated, much like in the Tibetan and the Chinese The image and text are intertwined, much like the Chinese Moxa Coterie manuals from Dunhuang. The text, like the Chinese or Tibetan Moxa Coterie text, describe the symptoms to be treated, then explain in words the locations to be treated. Though unlike the Chinese or the Tibetan text and images, this Uyghur exemplar does not specify the number of moksas to be burnt. The image is adorned with elongated earlobes, possibly inspired by Buddhist imagery. The hairstyle is remarkably similar to that in the Tibetan chart. The Chinese, Tibetan, and Uyghur medical illustrations represent important exemplars in the development of medical illustrations, bringing a naturalistic depiction of the human body together with practical diagrammatic elements. These are found shortly afterwards, also further west in Anatolia. When thinking about nexuses of knowledge interactions, we should also remember to think about constructed continuities and discontinuities. That is, where do we bother to look and where do we not? In this sense, I would like to suggest that one other field of knowledge that we have been discussing can be an excellent source of inspiration, and that is cartography. A key moment in formulating the Islam in Tibet project, which I initiated at the Warburg Institute in the years before working on the Dunhuang manuscript, was when Yossi Rapoport came to me with a map from the Book of Curiosities on which he was starting to work with Emily Savage Smith. This map, from a set of fascinating maps and texts composed in Egypt in the first half of the 11th century, intrigued us on several levels. It seemed to depict a route along a river, starting at Daibul, which is, and reaching the mountains of Tibet. We have here Jabal et-Tubat, and the Gate of China, here upside down, Babasine. It also appeared to mention Lhasa, although that's still not really sure. It's not clear what it says, but probably Madinat ul-Has. Coming from 11th century Cairo, we found this map of such a route quite intriguing. It became an important starting point for the Islam in Tibet project, on which I collaborated with Charles Burnett, Anna Akasoy, and Georges Halkias at the Warburg Institute, in which we explored myriad interactions between Tibet and the Islamic world, starting from the 8th century, and coining the term musk route to refer to these interactions and as an alternative to the more well-known Silk Roads. What transpired in Rapoport and Savage Smith's later work on this map is that it was not simply a map following the Indus River route, but more of an overlaying of the major routes of northern India. The Indus, the Ganges, and perhaps also the Brahmaputra, representing an overland route that augmented a maritime one and that overall connected Egypt with China via Tibet. Reading recently Frank Billet's discussion on the topology of certain maps, I think this map corresponds nicely to what he called shorthand for the geography of connections and networks, which goes beyond obvious borders, political entities, etc. Such maps should continue to intrigue us and to send us into probing expected and unexpected movements of knowledge. What this map and our findings from the Islam in Tibet project more generally exemplified is that we can look at Tibetan medicine itself as a nexus of knowledge and as a bridge of knowledge. I shall give one example which I began to discuss in the Entangled Itineraries book, the case of the transmission of the Siddhasara. The The Siddhasara is an illuminating example where we can trace an itinerary of a key text as it moves and gets translated into different languages and cultures. The Siddhasara is a comprehensive medical manual that includes the main theories and practices of Ayurveda that was written, or more likely edited, by Ravi Gupta in the 7th century. It originated from India, possibly Kashmir, and had widespread influence in various parts of Asia, both in Central Asia and West Asia. We can trace the movement of this text across languages as it traveled both northeast and west. In the 9th century, it was translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, as well as into Arabic. Around the 10th century, it was translated from Tibetan into Khotanese, and sometime before the 13th century, it was translated into Uyghur. The Siddhasara was also held in high esteem by Persian Arabic scholars. Arazi, from Rai, near modern-day Tehran, incorporated many passages of the Siddhasara into his Kitab al-Hawi fi Tib, the comprehensive book on medicine. The Kitab al-Hawi fi Tib was translated into Latin in the 13th century, and there are remnants of the Siddhasara in its many Latin versions. A Khotanese translation of the Khotanese translation of the Siddhasara has been found among the Dunhuang manuscripts. The material history of this manuscript provides a further dimension into this text transmission. Here is a case of a Sanskrit medical text, translated into Tibetan, then into Khotanese, carried from Khotan to Dunhuang by a Chinese monk on his way back from India, ending up in the possession of a Khotanese ambassador in Dunhuang who signed his name on the text in Sogdian. The introduction to the Khotanese translation of the Siddhasara, not found in any other version, gives us an inkling on the process of translation from language to language to language. At the time, the Khotanese introduction states that the text was translated from Tibetan, but as the translator found the Tibetan version problematic, he also consulted the Sanskrit original. As William McGrath has recently shown, the Siddhasara's focus on epidemic skin diseases allows us to understand its transmission path as one which follows plague. The introduction to the Khotanese translation presents the need for this translation, which, as we know from other contexts of plague more generally, came alongside the bafflement of plague, a need for a new understanding. This need is presented as the core reason for the royal sponsorship of this new translation. The disease was unrecognized, the introduction tells us, because they knew no theory of it. With no useful theory, or perhaps a gross misunderstanding of it, the application of medicaments were improper, and so many people died. What was available was a bad Tibetan translation, and hence the need arose for a Khotanese translation based on both the Tibetan and the Sanskrit. Thinking of this case within the history of pandemics, we know that pandemics more generally have called into question theories of the past, ushering rethinking and reformulations of various sorts. The case of the Siddhasara, then, is a good example of the need to think about issues of translation and transmission alongside the study of bioarchaeology, looking at transmissions of texts alongside the spread of pathogens. So to conclude, when thinking about which medical knowledge traveled easily, we can see that quick and easy practical knowledge traveled and still travels easily. Medical substances, particularly of the special kinds, and knowledge of their uses also travel easily, whilst the theories behind these practices and substances, behind the usage of these substances and practices, does not, or travels slow. Plagues obviously also move fast, and knowledge which somehow tries to deal with them follows too. When analyzing these movements, we ought to be thinking about the technologies and other practicalities which allow these movements to take place. That is why we are all here, together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker for this first panel of the afternoon is Stacey Van Vleet, who is assistant professor here at Berkeley. She works on the history of Tibet and Inner Asia. So she also touches on China and India as well. Her forthcoming book, or her book project, is titled The World the Medicine Buddha Built, Tibetan Medical Technologies and Infrastructure in Qing Inner Asia. And she has published in flagship journals, including the Bulletin of Tibetology, Asian Medicine, and the Cahiers d'Extrême-Asie. So please take the stage and join me in welcoming her.
And thank you for everyone for sticking with us this long and this late into your Saturdays. I know I'm starting to get tired, so I will endeavor to keep myself awake and to keep all of you awake as well. And thank you once again to Sanjot and Frank and the Tang Center for bringing us all here together. My talk today comes from the research for my book in progress, which Dominic graciously mentioned. And it focuses on the proliferation of Buddhist medical institutions across Inner Asia between the 17th and the early 20th century. And I want to mention at the outset that I will be covering quite a bit of ground today in order to try to make some broader historical and historiographical points. And so I'll have quite a bit of information. Unlike my usual presentations, I'll have quite a bit of information on the slides. And if there's things I gloss over, please ask me about them in the Q&A. So this period of this spread of Tibetan medical institutions overlapped with the period of the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. The model for these institutions was a state medical bureaucracy created in Lhasa, Tibet, by the 5th Dalai Lama between 1643 and 1682. The 5th Dalai Lama created a link between medical institutions and Buddhist governance that would endure all the way up through the present. But during the Qing period, the question is really, what relationship can we speak of between this regional network of Buddhist medical institutions and the Qing imperial formation? In what ways do Buddhist governance and imperial governance intersect in the field of medicine? So in order to understand relationships of medical institutionalization and governance in the Qing and in Inner Asia, I'll suggest that we need to look at two things. One is change over time, to ask what transformations occurred as a sphere of medical institutions and thought enlarged from a Tibetan sphere to an Inner Asian sphere, overlapping with an imperial sphere. But second, we need to consider exactly what institutionalization means in this context. And really, it means monasticization. And for that, we need to take the context of Buddhist intellectual history seriously as a rich sphere of competing ideas that informed governance. We know that webs of loyalty, networks of patronage, and even the foundations of military might shifted continuously over this period. It's not a unitary imperial formation. It's not static. But there's lots of rebellions, right? But there's something enduring, however contested, that Buddhists and scholars continue to recognize today. And I'm thinking in particular of the many recent medical histories and histories of these institutions that have been published inside the PRC that touch both upon local institutions and networks of various regional imagination. So what it is that is enduring, I would like to term infrastructure, which would cover both the material and intellectual infrastructure of Tibetan medicine. The growth and development of Buddhist monastic infrastructure bound these regions together and continues to serve today as a site for both mutual and competing investment. It may be undermined, its purposes may shift to things like tourism, but it cannot be entirely dispensed. And I want to make clear that these two medical institutions, these two Tibetan hospitals that exist today at Khumbu Monastery and the County Tibetan Hospital is right across the street, or really right across the parking lot, right? So these, I wasn't able to get them in the same frame of my camera, but they're right there together facing each other, the State Tibetan Hospital and the hospital within the monastery, which is on the left behind the gate of Khumbu Monastery. Today, Buddhist monastic medical colleges are remembered by Tibetan historians in the PRC as basically proto-public health institutions, providing medicine as a public good or a social service. And as such, they can be claimed as sites of meaning and legitimation by different parties at once, who seek a role in the governance of local communities. In some ways, monastic medical colleges played a similar role, back to this map, in the Qing period. Institutionalization of medicine was tied first to the state building project of the 5th Dalai Lama in the latter 17th century, which was both for Tibetans and Mongols, in which he explicitly characterized his medical activities as healing conflict or turning enemies into friends, and also promoting Buddhist governance under the auspices of his own Gelugpa monastic order. Second, or in the second phase, medicine and medical institution building became tied to Gelugpa missionary activity, which flourished especially in the Mongol regions that were most closely, or although certainly not statically or unproblematically, tied to the Qing imperial formation. So what did monastic medical colleges do that tied them to governance? First of all students at these Gelugpa medical colleges studied the four tantras, the 12th century root text of Tibetan medicine, albeit reaching different levels of skill in this study. There is evidence that monastic colleges trained physicians who served local officials and elites, local communities, and at the imperial court, and probably in that order. They were more tied to local elites than they were to the imperial court in Beijing. These monastic scholars and physicians are also connected to networks of trade and gifting in Materia Medica, despite the protestations to the contrary in monastic writing due to the prohibitions of monastic custom, right, of being involved in medicine as trade. But most importantly, at least at first, they produced precious pills. And precious pills, many of you might be familiar, are associated with mercury purification, ritualized mercury purification. And in this sense, it's a dual process, both an inner alchemy and an outer alchemy. The production of precious pills transformed substances and persons through their ritualized but also material protocol of production. And precious pill production demonstrates the mastery of the ritual officiant, the producer of the precious pills, over both the material and the non-material worlds. The pills and the practitioners accrue powerful tantric charisma, which is then also can be consumed when someone consumes the pill. And actually, the pills can either be eaten or worn, on the body. They have a range of benefits from healing specific illnesses, especially poisons, to protecting from weapons, to right on up to Buddhist awakening. And the main ritual associated with their production is the Yutok heart essence, the Yutok Nyingtik, which is originally a proprietary practice of the Zur medical tradition. The Zur medical tradition, before the 5th Dalai Lama's time, had two medical schools, two main medical schools. One was located at the main Karma Kagyu monastery of Tsurpu, which were the main monastic rivals of the Gelugpa and the 5th Dalai Lama. And the other Zur school, a branch of it, was actually at Samdrupse Fortress, the lay court of the king of Tsang. So these were the people that were defeated by Gushri Khan and the 5th Dalai Lama when they came to power in 1642. So the Yutok heart essence is a practice, right, a guru yoga that initiates practitioners into the Zur medical tradition, lineage, through the veneration of this, I was going to bring it up. Here we go. Through the veneration of this human ancestral medical progenitor, Yutok Yunten Gompo, that's him on the far right. But importantly, go back here, precious pills are also associated, and Barbara Gerke has written quite a bit about this, associated with a transgressive rhetoric and ingredients of tantric practice. So famously, Desi Sangye Gyatso, the 5th Dalai Lama's regent and successor, he criticizes the Zur medical tradition for their use of the liver of a young virgin girl as an ingredient. The 5th Dalai Lama, meanwhile, in one of his sets of monastic regulations for this medical school that he's appropriating, starting to sponsor, right? He criticizes some previous practitioners of the Yutok heart essence as elders who make mudras to others without thinking. And if they don't accept the reforms of the practice that he's making, he says it will be because of their doubts of attachment drawn like water from the valley of the Kagyupa. So he's explicitly associating, sort of acknowledging, what he's doing here and how it's sort of opposition to the Kagyu in particular. So this medicine became very important to the 5th Dalai Lama, fashioning himself as a charismatic leader. And Desi Sangye Gyatso associates precious pills with the white umbrella of the 5th Dalai Lama's governance over Tibet, Mongolia, and China. But in order to practice the Yutok heart essence and produce precious pills, the 5th Dalai Lama had to appropriate them from the Kagyu by appealing to a different lineage of practice associated with another Tibetan tradition, and that's the Nyingma. So the 5th Dalai Lama presents himself in general, as we know from Jacob Dalton, as unifying and systematizing traditions, including medical traditions, but he's doing so selectively and very much at the expense of the Kagyu. Also, he had to purify precious pills ritually and materially. So materially, he purified these into a process that he described this in one of my articles, a process of transforming wealth into health. He had gathered all of these jewels and metals, precious metals, along his travels to Beijing, to the Qing court to meet the Shunzhi emperor in Beijing, and he, Mongols and Tibetans along the way gave him all of these offerings. He brought them back to Lhasa, and he literally ground up, or describes himself grinding up these gems and precious metals into pills that that would be ingested for the benefit, right, of all. Ritually, he wrote his own medicine Buddha practice of precious pills, and required his monastic medical students to practice this once a week, okay? Including these previous school of the Zor tradition. So he said explicitly in his regulations for that Zor school that those physicians could still practice the Yutok heart essence, but that the medicine Buddha practice, would be the one that would take precedence, right, in this weekly communal assembly, and provide the foundation, really, for monastic life. So this relationship is, I would say, reflected in the fifth Dalai Lama's famous historical equivalency between the medicine Buddha and the Yutok Yonten Gompo. And I'm not going to get into this, this long-standing debate. And long-standing means centuries, right? At least since the 11th century, people have been debating about whether the four tantras were authored by the medicine Buddha or Yutok Yonten Gompo. Fifth Dalai Lama answers this question by saying it's the medicine Buddha, but the medicine Buddha is inseparable from Yutok Yonten Gompo. Right? And I would argue that's not just a narrative move, that's a move of orthodoxy. So precious pills were known as the primary specialty of Tibetan medicine before the fifth Dalai Lama, at the fifth Dalai Lama's court, but in the context of the monastic medical network of the Qing Inner Asia, they nearly ceased to be mentioned. So what's going on? Note that I'm not saying they necessarily cease to exist. That's very hard to prove, right? But the sources, they're just not talking about them. In the Qing period, many recognizable aspects of medical institutionalization start to take place: building schools, printing texts, examinations, terminal degrees, and creating hierarchical yet modular administrative structures amongst these medical colleges. But what preceded all of these sort of recognizable institutional developments, I would argue, was, and made the systematization of medical knowledge possible, I would argue, is the fifth Dalai Lama's and later projects of the systematization of medical rituals. So ritual systems, in this sense, encoded doctrinal frameworks, we might say epistemologies, frameworks for understanding and producing potency in both practitioners and substances. And they did so, again, in a sphere of competing ideas, deploying discourses of purification and purity. We can talk more about that later. So now I want to briefly walk through some of the stages in Buddhist medical institutionalization in Inner Asia. So briefly walking through some of the stages in medical institutionalization in Inner Asia. And this is just a very partial list of sources that these maps are drawn from, which include Tibetan surveys and histories of Buddhism, surveys of monasteries, both modern and pre-modern histories, and surveys of monasteries, histories of Buddhism and its spread in regions, surveys from Chinese scholars, Isabelle Charlot's work from Inner Mongolia and other smaller sources that supplement some of the places in Inner Mongolia. There's this fabulous survey of Khalkh Mongolian monasteries, Outer Mongolia, right, online that you can peruse, and it's actually been incorporated into the BDRC website, Treasury of Lives website, both. So that's a great place to look if you're interested in monasteries in Khalkh Mongolia. And then some sources from the Chinese context too, right? Memorials, gazetteers, Wenshi Zuliao, both of those were very important. Okay, so the first sort of phase here, I would say, is institutionalization under the fifth Dalai Lama. We already talked about it. He's patronizing medicine and building medical schools to heal conflict and propagate Buddhist governance. And so these would be his three medical schools. Two are in Lhasa and one is in Sang at the court of the defeated king, or ruler of Sang, and we'll talk about that Mongolian one later. What happens there? production of official texts, a new official edition of the Four Tantras that forms then the basis for his examinations. The students have to give what he calls word-for-word examinations on this particular print of the Four Tantras. There's also something called the Minrampa designation, which is separate from the examinations. It's later I'll start to call it a terminal degree, a degree of medicine. But at this point, there's just one person who has, under the fifth Dalai Lama, there's just one person who is known as a Minrampa. That's Dharma Minrampa, who's the person responsible for the production of all of these texts. That really what they're doing is, again, incorporating all of this knowledge from the Zur medical tradition in particular. And then, of course, his medical orthodoxy, which included the fifth Dalai Lama's own new manuals for the Yuta Cart Essence and the medicine, the Menla Dochok Sutra ritual. Second, there is the centralization or consolidation of medical training in central Tibet by Desi Sangye Gyatso. And so this has been more of the famous moment in Tibetan medical institutionalization. Desi Sangye Gyatso gets credited for a lot because he actually closes the fifth Dalai Lama's schools and creates his own medical monastery, the Iron Hill, Chakbori, that stands alone. This will become important later. It's not part of another monastery, right? It's its own standalone monastery, completely devoted to medical field. And you can see actually on the side of this painting here, the camels and nomads that are facing Chakbori and venerating it. And talking with people in interviews and some of the medical colleges, oral history basically, they would talk about nomads coming to pitch their tents close to the monastery, close to the medical college, and coming to seek treatment. Near. So this is, potentially a representation of something like that. This modern photograph, by the way, shows Chakbori on the left, and you can see how close it is, and also its stature. I mean, the perspective is strange. It looks higher than the Potala Palace of the Dalai Lamas. It's not higher, but they are both, major architectural monuments in the city, right? Which gives you some idea of their importance, both of them, the Palace of the Dalai Lamas and the medical palace of Desi Sangye Gyatso, their stature within the governance of these two figures. So Desi Sangye Gyatso is known more for what we might call practical medical scholarship. He incorporates this tradition that had been done by previous Tibetan medical traditions of field expeditions to gather medicinal plants and identify them in the field. And he also sends something that is described in Chinese as yaolin, a medicinal forest, to the Kangxi emperor. I found this in a memorial and was unable to actually have access to it at the Palace Museum. I found it in a catalog. I went to the Palace Museum. They said, oh, it says Tibet. Nope, you can't see it. So sadly, I'm not really sure if this means, a copy of his commentary or a painting, but something, one of those. Second phase in medical institutionalization, really institutionalization outside of central Tibet. And this is mainly associated with three figures that are often known in Mongolian historiography as the three lamps of Halch, along with an Oirat figure as well. So all of these Mongolians were present in Lhasa during the fifth Dalai Lama and Desi Sangye Gyatso's projects. They're taking part in both writing and sponsoring medical printing, and then they go back, right, to their homelands and start to build or invite physicians, really. And this is, possibly, one hesitates to say the first about anything, right? But certainly in Mongolian historiography today, claimed as the first medical college in Mongolia. After the assembly of Dolonor, when the Halch Mongolians submit to the Qing, and along with many of the Inner Mongolians that had not yet submitted to the Qing, these same figures actually start to build more medical colleges in Inner Mongolia. Now they're actually resident in Beijing, resident in Inner Mongolia, and so the focus of their institution building shifts there. You can see these points on the map in far northeast. So moving on, institutionalization and Qing imperial expansion. The Qing Empire is expanding across these regions. It's fighting the Dzungars in particular. Incorporates Qinghai after the Lubzang Dungeon Rebellion, and especially soon after conflicts and incorporations take place, medical colleges tend to pop up. You also, though, have a dispersal of those Menrampa degree holders from Lhasa that are also starting to be responsible for building medical institutions. Okay, thanks. You have an Amban, a Qing representative at Kumbum Monastery, who specifically calls for the tantric college that was leveled in the recent war to be rebuilt as a medical college. Again, seeing something of the close association between medicine and tantra. You have, did I show it here? You can see far off to the west there, medical colleges among the Dzungars, and sort of a brief detente of the hostilities there. And importantly, you have these new medical colleges in this context becoming part of existing monasteries. What's often, not always, but often a 4-college structure within Gelugpa monasteries, so it's no longer separate. Medicine is no longer practiced separately. It's being incorporated in these monasteries, and that means that that medicine has to now fit into the ritual and doctrinal program of the monastery that it's part of in some way. That's what we'll see next. Institutionalization and Qing imperial infrastructure. This is just about to show that there is some overlap with imperial administration. After the reorganization of the banners, the civil military administrative structure of the Qing, people are getting titles. The Qing court is appointing lay and monastic officials known as jasach. They are sponsoring monasteries. Most of the new medical colleges built in this period are actually associated with these Qing officials or hereditary princes or administrative offices, yamen. Right? So there's many, many monasteries that don't have medical colleges, but the ones that do have medical colleges are often associated with some sort of Qing, entitled person. And the Menrampa degree is spreading. So there's a shift in the center of gravity, right, for medical education towards Amdo and Mongolia. This is the part of my project that's the least developed, but certainly there is some overlap with institutions within the Qing imperial capitals. There are monastic medical colleges at the Tibetan monasteries at both the capital in Beijing and the summer capital at Zhohol. These monasteries are, again, producing medical texts, official Qing translation of the 4 tantras into Mongolian. There is evidence from other scholars that Lama physicians are serving the imperial family. I'm not so sure about their relationship with these court institutions of the imperial pharmacy and the Shangsa Yuan. Although the idea that Mongolian physicians, Mengyi, are producing Dingzi Yao in the imperial pharmacy is sort of intriguing, because the way that these ingot medicines are described, they have very similar wearable or ingestible, very ritualized process of production, incorporating precious materials, but also incorporating materials like clams that are definitely not found in the Tibetan context, right? So I don't know yet. You have an interesting, though, in the Pentaglot Dictionary, equivalencies between Tibetan terms for medical colleges, Mendra, Membidra, and the Imperial Medical Bureau, and other, court physicians, Lamen, and imperial physicians, Tai-yi. So that's also interesting. All right, so I will hopefully be able to say a little bit, about my sort of final example. Labrang Tashikil Monastery in Amdo, Lake Kokonor region, becomes a second pivot point of medical orthodoxy in the Qing Inner-Asian sphere. And this is the sort of final view of the map that, you could see actually so much of this institutionalization takes place in the 19th century and the early 20th century. A very politically fragmented time in this region, but Labrang Monastery plays an outsized role in becoming the mother monastery, the mother medical college, actually, to a lot of these later medical colleges. So here's just some of the sources, histories, and biographies, monastic regulations for the medical college. I won't worry too much about the gradual establishment of this medical college, other than to say that it claimed lineage from the Iron Hill. A physician who left Lhasa, became a court physician for a local Mongol prince, and then was invited after the prince's death, actually 10 years after his death, to Labrang Tashikil Monastery, where his lineage was then incorporated into the monastery. And he was known, this physician, Sang Menpa, was known as an expert for precious pills. And we have, in fact, extant copies of his writings on precious pills, his recipes, right? No mention of that at Labrang Tashikil. It's so weird. Commonalities with the Iron Hill in Lhasa and the Labrang Medical College. Things like the plant collection, examinations, medical murals, the Menrampa degree. Innovations. Institutionally, you have something called the mentri, the medical teaching throne, or the throne holder. You could also translate as the abbot of the medical college. Those throne holders are responsible mainly for implementing orthodoxy. They rarely, this is all described in the Ocean Annals, the Zheme Chunchung, they're very rarely trained in medicine. They're doctrinal philosophy people, sometimes Tantra people. But they have the highest position, and they rotate within a monastery to different colleges, and they also rotate between monasteries. So they're the ones that sort of maintain these connections of, I'm certainly not a unitary Orthodox system, but they are all, participating in a common project of administration, and that's their bailiwick, is in ritual orthodoxy. They take their orders from the monastery abbot, and they implement that. The head medical teachers are under them at the medical college, and these are the people who are trained as physicians and who stay at the medical college and teach medicine and also teach ritual. This is the first place where you see the term Mendra, the same one from the Qing Pentaglot Dictionary, and it's at the same time period, so that's just an interesting footnote. So curricular innovations, the first time that it's specifically mentioned that there would be 2 or later more levels of medical training, this is usually presented as the physicians either memorizing 3 out of the 4 tantras or all of the 4 tantras, right? The really expert ones, learn them all. But my my instinct is that there's another level of regulation that's taking place there also, and it has to do with the new ritual program. So instead of doing the practice of the medicine Buddha once a week, they're now doing the Akshobhya ritual, which is the ritual common across Labrang Monastery, and it's especially associated with incorporating, maybe appropriating Nyingma practices into Guha Samaja, right, into the Gelugpa context. This is the ritual curriculum that the first monastic regulations set out for the medical students in particular. And you can see it's all very Gelugpa-sized. Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga, Heart Sutra. Also, Welmang Pandita, in his history of Labrang Tashikil, makes this very interesting distinction. Because there was no earlier action or Kriya Tantra sadhana, from his own voice, he raised up the 9 Akshobhya sadhana action Tantra practice according to a very pure method. This is the practice that then gets practiced every week, right? So why is this important? Basically, it constitutes my conclusion. Kriya Tantra, associated with an exoteric framework of ritual practice, visualizing the deity separately as serving, and the practitioner is serving the deity, receiving blessings, rather than meditatively identifying with and becoming the agent in the ritual. So the rituals of Kriya are often external activities in the externally observable material world. It's also very much associated with normative monastic ethics and monastic discipline. You take the pratimoksha, Vinaya-based vows. And because it ranks in the Gelugpa system as the lowest form of Tantra, that means it's the most widely accessible to the highest number of students. So my guess, and I'm very interested in what you all think of this, but my guess as to what's happening here is that Labrang Tashikil Medical College was creating divisions, levels of medical students, and restricting access into certain aspects of tantric practice according to the Gelugpa graduated path, stages of the path pedagogy. It was placing medical tantra in a Gelugpa rather than a Nyingma framework. It doesn't mean that the highest yoga tantra was not practiced. There is this ongoing debate, a tutelary deity debate between the Gelugpa Vajra Bhairava and the Nyingma associated Hayagriva. And this is another question, were precious pills replaced? But that's maybe a thought for another time. So the conclusion of the talk is really just to reiterate that it's this ritual systematization that makes all of these other, the spread of Tibetan medicine possible, right? And the accessibility of medical learning more widely accessible to great numbers of students, hundreds of students that would be part of these colleges. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanking the organizers of this weekend, and especially Sanjo and Frank. It's been a really intellectually rich 3 days, and luckily we get to go out with a bang talking about more manuscriptology and codicology with two of my academic heroes, and I'm not joking. The first is Brandon Dotson, who is Associate Professor and Thomas P. McKenna Chair of Buddhist Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. He has taught and researched at many interesting places, including Oxford, SOAS, UCSB, and in Munich. His work concerns ritual, narrative, and cosmology and the interaction of Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions in the Tibetan cultural area. In particular, he works closely with Tibetan Dunhuang manuscripts to explore the history and culture of the Tibetan Empire from the 7th to the 9th centuries. One of the reasons that Brandon is one of my academic heroes is because his work is so rigorous and so far-reaching. So for example, he has been part of numerous collaborative research projects that have resulted in important publications, including a volume called Kingship, Ritual, and Narrative in Tibet and the Surrounding Cultural Area. One of my all-time favorites, Codicology, Paleography, and Orthography of Early Tibetan Documents, Methods, and a Case Study. And also the Old Tibetan Annals and Annotated Translation of Tibet's First History, among many other publications. Today he's going to talk about adaptation networks and device divination from India to Central Asia to Africa. So let us please welcome him.
All right, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to also thank Sanjot and thank Frank for organizing this conference. Thank the Center for Tang Studies for putting on this fantastic conference. I was saying at lunch yesterday that they've really raised the bar, and next time anybody invites me to speak anywhere, I'm going to demand that they first show me a picture of the swimming pool in the hotel where I'm going to be staying. You know, I'm going to be a diva. So when Frank invited me to this conference, I was in the midst of working on sutra copying, the work of Chinese, mostly Chinese and some Tibetan and other ethnicities, copying sutras as a gift for the Tibetan emperor in Tibetan and in Chinese in the 820s, 830s, and 840s. And I thought, well, I could just talk about this. It's what I'm doing day in and day out. But looking at the list of other speakers and looking at their possible topics and the extent of it going further west, all the way to Africa, I thought, no, I should probably talk about dice divination. So that's what you're going to get today. I'm poking my head up from my work on sutra copies to go back to something that I've done a bit of in recent years, which is dice divination. So let me just introduce myself as a proverbial frog in the well. Many of you know this Chinese proverb of the frog down in the well enjoys it there. It's a nice place to live, but then it gets a bit dry and the frog has to climb up out of the well and is shocked to see this entire world out there. So that's a bit like me in the sense that I'm a Tibetologist. I work in Dunhuang manuscripts. When as a grad student I first started working in Dunhuang, there was a professor, Glenn Dudbridge, he told me, don't do that, you'll get stuck there. You'll get stuck in Dunhuang, it just sucks you in. So the frog in the well metaphor is probably appropriate that way. But one thing that I found, and that I think probably many in this room have also found, is that when you get stuck into any topic long enough, and for me that's law, that's historiography, that's epic, that's divination, that's ritual, when you do that, you end up getting pulled up out of your well, whatever well that might be. So it's my contention that I'm not really climbing up out of the well, but these topics just keep pulling me up out of the well and showing me these daunting vistas. The question then is what you do with those daunting vistas. Do you climb back down into the well? Do you just gasp? For me, I've been dealing with it with help. And you can see some of the help I've had from my sinologist friends that resulted in this book that I'm showing you here. That's Connie Cook and Zhao Lu, who I leaned on to study and translate a 10th century Chinese dice divination text called the Divination of Maheshvara. So today, with people in the room who are conversant in Turkish, in Persian, in Arabic, I thought that I might make a little bit of a pitch and see if I can make some friends among you, maybe entice you to collaborate or to do the work for me so I can just read your fantastic translations and studies. So what I'll do is introduce the basics of this system to you and also relay to you some of the progress that I think I've made, some of the insights that I think I can offer about this, with the caveat that those come from my own background as a Tibetologist. I'll see how these have possibly served me in looking at other texts that belong to this tradition of divination, and then go on to ask a few questions of what else we might do with this large project in looking at transmission, looking at adaptation. So in the basics of this system, and is the die going around? Did you start passing that around? Okay, so there's a material object being passed around that you see an image of on the screen here. This is called a pashika in Sanskrit. It's a four-sided die. You can see them at the side in the lower left-hand corner, and you can see the four sides of the dice photographed individually. Those are from Tashila on the left, lower left. Those are from Vikramashila. But the basics of this system is to use a randomizing device, ideally one of these dice, to get a value from 1 to 4. And you do this 3 times. You might get a 2, a 1, and a 4, or a 4, a 1, and a 4. You're doing it serially, so it matters what comes first, what comes in the middle, and what comes last. Metaphorically, that is 4 values to the 3rd power. That's 64 possible combinations. So you make a mantic figure, like a 2, 4, 1, or 2 pips, 4 pips, and 1 pip, and you look that up in a book. That mantic figure, that combination of values, indexes an oracular response in a divination book. So, optionally, that oracular response might be named after a god, or a demon, or a spirit. Optionally, it might be poetic. It might also be very prosaic and simply tell you, this is good for marriage, this is good for trade, this is bad for fighting with your neighbors. So that's the basic outlines of it. Now, just to give you a sample, and I'm going to be going through a couple samples, most of them being 414. You see here those circles. Those are not zeros, calling back to Bill's paper yesterday. Those are pips. And what you find in many of these manuscripts is a kind of transposition of the dice pips onto the page in the form of circles. Other times they're translated into letters or translated into numbers. So here you would see these pips on the page. And going down through this scroll, this is a very long scroll that also includes a law text that mentions the use of dice. Which, that's how this whole thing got started, in fact, while I was studying law and stumbled across this. It would say, from the mouth of the road god, you, O human, the gods regard you with compassion. If you've cast this divination for a legal case, you will go free. If you go trading, you will win a profit. Without thinking to yourself, I am wise. Salute the gods, and whatever you wish shall come to pass. A good divination. So you see there a little bit of the semantics at work here. This second person hailing in the divine voice, the marking of alterity of you in the second person as a human in distinction to the voice that hails you, which is not. That's just part of the semantics of this system in some of its expressions. Not all of the oracular responses are in second person like this. Right, so here's a map that we've seen a few times over the past few days, and you can see some very small images of texts and dice on this. It's by no means complete, it's just a kind of pastiche of some of these finds. But I wanted to sketch for you the kind of progress that I think I've made on this, and my working hypothesis that this tradition comes out of India. That hypothesis is resting on the material cultural record. The earliest texts come from India, and the earliest dice, well, they also come from India. In particular, when you go back to finds at Mohenjo-Daro on the surface, and also quite a bit further down, dating to the mid-3rd millennium BCE, we can probably say this is an Indic tradition. But the vast majority of dice finds are later, the ones from Gujarat, the ones from Tashila, the ones from up the Indus and over the Oxus into contemporary Uzbekistan, in Kucha, in Khotan. These tend to be dated 1st millennium CE. And when you find them in a museum, it'll generally be as vague as that. Sometimes it will say early 1st millennium, sometimes it will even venture to say 7th to 9th centuries. But generally, the conservators are hedging their bets and saying 1st millennium CE, so I'll follow that here. One thing that we notice here is that the distribution of these dice generally tracks the movement of Buddhism out of north-central India to Tashila, Gandhara, into Bactria, and further east into Dunhuang, Turfan, etc. In terms of the texts, also the earliest texts are Indic. They're not actually from India, but rather from Kucha. We've heard the Bauer manuscript mentioned a few times as well here, a compilation text with medical texts, and also with tantric texts and divination texts. So we have Sogdian, Turkish, Tibetan, and Chinese texts from sites such as Dunhuang, Turfan, Miran, Mazar-Tag. Most of these are 9th to 10th century. So I want to quickly show you some of these before going on to the westward extent of this transmission as far as I've tracked it so far. First, just to show you this image, you can see those pips on the page. Again, not zeros, but values, dice pips. And one of those insights that I think I've gained from working with the body of Tibetan texts, which are fragmentary, which are sometimes complete, notionally complete, but functionally never complete, in the sense that this is a practice tradition where you have repeated responses, omitted responses. What I find is that you don't, not never, but you don't often have the same response indexed by the same value. So if you look up 241 in one text, it's not the same as 241 in another text. So this tells you that this is a practice tradition. It's not a fixed sacred text that has to be transmitted accurately from one textual witness to another textual witness. So we do have some distinctions in terms of whether or not a text will use direct speech of the gods or spirits versus poetry. Oddly enough, when we have oracular poetry in Tibetan, when we have verse, it doesn't come from the mouths of gods. You'd think that gods would speak more eloquently, speak in verse, speak more beautifully, but they don't. They say very boring things like this is good for you or this is bad for you, or they tend to. I should say, though, that there is a later tradition, once we get to the 13th and 14th century, of a standardized Tibetan version that you find in the Tenjur. And there you do find a complete text of 64 oracular responses, and the textual witnesses are consistent. All right, so going through some of these texts and going through chronologically, we have the Bauer manuscript. This is a birch bark Poti format text dating to the early 6th century, found in Kumtura near Kucha. We have medical texts. We have 2 separate dice divination texts, which again nods to this notion that these 2 texts are different, yet side by side. It's not the same text. It's not a fixed text. The first text begins with the descending triplets, 444, 333, 222, 111, and its oracular responses are organized differently than those that you find in the second text. In the second text, if you were to stick with our theme and look at 414, this is the oracular response that you would get. And you see here some interesting things about it, where it has the numbers first written out, and then it writes them out fully, 4, 1 in the middle, 4 at the end, in a sentence. And this also mentions Maheshvara, who occurs in a few of these other texts as well, across different languages, and mentions a different class of deity, the Devata, right? Your Kula Devata, your family deity. And it's kind of a nod to the genre of this text, which is between technology, between technique, and high religion, right, where you do find such things as devatas. The pantheon, similarly, is a kind of mixture of pantheon and pandemonium, of high gods and more mundane gods, gods of the hearth, for example. So closely related to this, in both time and space, is a Tokharian text from Kucha. This is Paleo-Kuchian, new series, and you have leaves 1, 4, 5, and 6, which include this text. The other leaves are medical and tantric. So again, we see this kind of connection between medical texts, divination, and ritual texts. Medical texts and divination texts often being used hand in hand, and of course divination overlapping with the technologies of diagnosis, prognosis, and sometimes also prescription, right? You get a bad divination, it might come with a prescription to do this or that ritual to stave off the bad fortune that you've just received or perhaps created through this ritual. So this is in Subashi. It's generally dated to the early 7th century. It's the topic of a study in preparation by Huang, and Pinot. So I won't anticipate their conclusions here, but just say that you can see from this, this slide here the similarities to the prognosis in the Bauer manuscript in form, and also a little bit in content there when it's mentioning Vishnu, Maheshvara, and the goddess. Mentioning this token, this kind of aha moment in the divination where you know this is true because you dreamt this. Sometimes it'll use something else. It will use a mole. It will say, this divination is true, and you know this because you have a mole by your left eye, right? So it's a curious thing, easily falsifiable, of course, but that's something you find in this one, in the Bauer manuscript, and I found it in a Tibetan manuscript as well. Perhaps the most famous in this type of divination tradition is the Irkbitik. Again, that's just a genre term. It means a book of omens. Here, too, you have the roundels on the page, and it's beginning with 4 triplets. From this version of 414, you can see a sort of different sensibility, right? It's third person. You do have some first person text. There's one where a leopard is speaking. But it's very much a vignette. And it only ends with, know thus, this is good, as just about all of these end with this is good or this is not good. But it's leaving to you, the client, or to you, the diviner, the work of making sense of what this vignette means and applying it to your own situation. It doesn't do that work for you by making a simile and saying, so too is it for you, O human, or anything of that sort. So the text that I was working on with Connie Cook and Zhao Lu is also a compilation. It's a large codex, kind of unwieldy, but I suppose you can fold it, and there are marks of it having been folded in order to move around. It has divination texts, astrological texts, and medical texts. The content is split about half and half between medical on the one hand and divinatory and astrological on the other. You can see at the top, if you read Chinese, that it uses numbers. So they're not putting the pips on the page, they're not using letters, they're not spelling it out, but using numbers, not using counting rods either. And a callback to Amanda's talk, you see the bookbinding article by Colin Chinnery, again, doing good work for all of us in showing what a butterfly-bound book looks like. So if you were to roll a 414, in this context, in the 10th century, and Huang is a Chinese Buddhist or Chinese Taoist, if there is any meaningful distinction between those two things at that time and place, you would get this prognosis, this oracular response. Here you can see a kind of prescription. After you contemplate goodness, you will be promoted. Also, perhaps an echo of the long-standing divinatory concern with careers and officials that you find in Chinese divination. Moving on to some Sogdian texts from Turfan, we have a study, recent one by Nicholas Sims Williams. We have these 2 texts, 2 Sogdian manuscripts, and one uses these letters, so it's not using numbers, it's not using pips, but rather using letters, and that's a very interesting innovation that we'll come back to. The other one is a fragment, uses lines. Bill was talking about counting rods yesterday, and the use of counting rods, sometimes just horizontal, sometimes just vertical. Here, if these are counting rods, they're being just used vertically. In a mantic context, in Chinese divination, it tends to be the case that counting rods are horizontal, vertical, and then horizontal for showing a trigram like the 141 that you see pictured here. So this is something of an outlier to use counting rods this way in the context of divination, if indeed we can call these counting rods. So here we have this one section of this codex, and you have gamma, alpha, gamma, essentially, and this would be the response that you would get in this text. This is following Nicholas Sims Williams' translation. Here again, there's the second person hailing, "O man," or "O human," again marking alterity in a very direct way. That's one of the things that's so fascinating, or that I find fascinating about this kind of aleatory form of communication where you don't know what you're communicating with. You don't know which God is going to respond to you. It's up to the dice. But then when it does respond, it's direct. It's hailing. It's saying, "You, human," putting you under the microscope in that way. Right, and then here's what it would look like in that fragment, the second fragment. So here, there's sort of an echo of the Irkbitik, just this preoccupation with animals, but you see that the work is being done for you. It's very close to the distinction between metaphor and simile, where metaphor would characterize the Irkbitik, simile would characterize this. On you too, those gods will take pity. You were like that wet tiger who got dry. Right? It's telling you what this means. You don't have to figure it out for yourself. And in a lot of divination texts, these oracular responses also include something, as I mentioned, that just spells it all out for you. It says this is good for trade, this is good for childbirth, this is good for health, this is good for warfare. So in showing you all of these, some questions come up just in terms of on what basis are we making judgments about relationships between one text and another text, if texts they be. Is it the content, the kind of semantic content that I've just been mentioning to you? Is it the subject matter, the fact that the Chinese text talks a bit more about officials, that the Indic texts talk a bit more about sex? Is it this distinction between metaphor and simile, between verse and prose? What about sequence? The fact that a text might start with the triplets 444, 333, 222, 111, that it might go generally from 4s to 3s to 2s to 1s, or that it might go in an inverse order or no order at all. If we find two texts that follow the same order but have different content, what do we say about this? Is it the material culture? Is that die still going around? Has everybody seen it? Good, good. You don't have to use a die. There's a 19th century text from Turkey, and it doesn't use this kind of die. It says, look, if you don't have a die, just write the first 4 letters of the alphabet on identical pieces of paper and pull one out, and then put them back, and then pull one out and put them back, and then pull a third out, and you've done it. So you can draw lots to do it. Or you can use a different type of 4-sided die that looks like a pyramid. Also, we know about this because of books, and there's panels about books. But that doesn't preclude the possibility of this being an oral tradition. It's quite simple, comparatively speaking, to have 64 different oracular responses in your head or in your repertoire as an oral ritual performer. Indeed, practitioners of Ifa have a few more than that in their head as oral performers, also for al-ramal divination. The ritual process, is it sincerity, as you'd think of in a Chinese context of possibly being important, that you have to use? Or is there something more playful about this aleatory mode of communication with something? As for that something, do the gods matter? Do you need them there? Or is this a communication that's not reliant on the presence of gods or the presupposition of gods or spirits? So one obvious framework for this is Bruno Latour's actor network theory, where when looking at all of this variation and adaptation that we have across these texts, across different languages, some in third person, some in first, some with poetry, some without, some with gods, some without, you can see that any one of these things can come to the fore and be extremely important. You can over-theorize dice and the cosmology encoded in the 4 faces of the die, or you cannot give a damn about that. The diviner could be extremely important in communicating with the gods as an intermediary, or it could be a do-it-yourself divination. The gods, as I mentioned, could be important. The mantic sign, the combination of pips, could be seen as something more like a talisman that activates a god. Or it could be, again, under-theorized, taken for granted. All of these can come to the fore or slip into the background. So why are we looking at pizza? We just had pizza for lunch. We had different types of pizza. You can have pizza with red sauce. You can have pizza with cheese, pizza without cheese. There's deep dish pizza, but they all have in common dough, generally. I think that's probably what you'd have to insist on for pizza being pizza. The dough in this system is the specific method of employing randomized numbers or values to index and to delimit a fixed number of oracular responses. So the I Ching has 64 oracular responses, but you get to those through a different method of combination. As a thought experiment, you could put the 64 responses of the divination of Maheshvara into an I Ching text, and they would still be different in this formulation because they would have different dough, same toppings. So, coming to the westward expansion and coming further up out of the well. It was about 10 years ago I got an email from my PhD student, and she had taken some snaps in the Louvre, said, these dice that you've been talking about, I saw one in the Louvre, but it says it's from Egypt. What's going on here? And I thought, wow, that's very interesting, and did some digging, found some more that are also provenance to Fustat, that's to say to Cairo, some that are unprovenanced but thought to be possibly from Fustat, in the Khalili collection in the Louvre. So the question comes up then, how and when was this dice divination system transmitted to as far west as Egypt? And we'll get into why that would be a divination system and not just individual objects right here, because we have the texts, right? I mentioned this Ottoman Turkish dice divination text. That's not what you're looking at here. That's a different text. But this was translated in 1899 by de Codemanche. You have, again, like the Irk-Bitik just being a genre term, you have genre terms like Kitab al-Fal and Fal-Nama, sometimes specifying that they're using Qura, claromancy. And they tend to use letters, right? We saw one text from Central Asia that uses letters. In these Arabic, Persian, and Turkish texts, you find letters being used rather consistently, the first 4 letters of the alphabet instead of pips or instead of numbers. So here's what you would get for a 414 in that 19th century Turkish text, which you're not looking at in this picture, but you are reading on that slide. And you can see here too, just going back to that motif of pizza toppings, how you can take all those toppings off, use the system of combination, and adapt it to your own linguistic and aesthetic and religious concerns, ending with this obligatory inshallah. This is the same thing when you adapt, say, the Sortes Aliarum as a pagan tradition in 2nd and 3rd century Anatolia, and you make it into a Latin Christian tradition, and now you've substituted the apostles for pagan gods. An interesting text that I would love to interest somebody in, and I'd love to hear a translation of, is found again in a compilation, a codex that includes the Kitab al-Bulhan, the Book of Wonders. The different texts are dated to different times. Some of the earliest are to the end of the 14th century. You can see the compiler here. Colophons mention different owners, and we have further sites here that are important in terms of the maps that we've seen and the different networks that we've seen today and yesterday. Aleppo, Edirne going up into the border between Turkey and modern Greece. And here too, you don't just use the first 4 letters of the alphabet, but you use the letters of the name of Jafar al-Sadiq, the purported author of this divination tradition. So there's a kind of playfulness. And of course, that playfulness is something that you find in so-called letter magic traditions that are popular in Arabic, but also in the Judaic world as well. So this brings up some questions. This playfulness also, I should say, overlaps in the object that you're looking at right now. Here you can see a scorpion, for one, but you also see the first 4 letters of the alphabet as you would expect for a divination die of this type, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4. But then you see pips that are different, 1, 2, 6, and 5, indicating that this die could be used for divination, but it could also be used for playing nard, or in India, chaupur, pachizi. So that's one thing where in seeing how the contents tend to shift and be adaptable, and how repetition happens and omission happens, and that's such a part of this, that aleatory aspect of play seems to infuse this tradition with a sense of movement, a sense of change. So the questions that I would love to have answered, which I cannot answer, are the Islamic texts as fluid as these others that we've been looking at from Central Asia, or as the sequence and content of the oracular responses become standardized in the manner of a fixed or sacred text? And then looking at Judeo-Arabic sources from the 9th through 12th century in the Cairo Geniza, are there Sefer Goralat texts of this type? They've been mentioned. I did read an article that mentioned a few texts of this type, but nothing actually went into detail on it, and everybody I've reached out to about it says something that we say in the context of Dunhuang manuscripts. There's so much there, and we haven't done it all, right? So this might be still there to look at. And then the other questions, which perhaps you all can help me with, is where else might we look for the transmission of this tradition for other branches of this particular divination tradition, besides where I've shown you today? And of course, if you're interested in taking up any of this work, please get in touch. And now that you've held that die in your hand, if you come across any in your travels, please drop me a line.
Thank you for that talk, Brandon. I'll resist going into detail about my own divinatory practices with tarot and oracle cards. We could save that for drinks, but there's a lot that's familiar. I'd now like to introduce Susan Huang, who is Associate Professor of Transnational Asian Studies at Rice University. Her research focuses on 10th to 14th century Taoist and Buddhist visual culture in China. Among her many published articles are many that I've used in my own work, thinking about the Dunhuang documents and specifically the Dunhuang prints, some of which I showed a couple of nights ago. And again, I said that Brandon and Susan are my academic heroes because really, again, the rigor and reach of their work is significant, and I think that we'll see some of that here today. Her first book is called Picturing the True Form, Taoist Visual Culture in Traditional China, and that was published by Harvard University Press in 2012. And I believe that her talk today, which is called Buddhist Book Roads from Turfan to Beijing to Hangzhou in the 13th and 14th centuries, comes from her forthcoming book to be published by Brill, entitled Dynamic Spread of Buddhist Print Culture, Networks and Book Roads in China and Its Neighbors. So please join me in welcoming Susan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the Tang Center for organizing this super stimulating conference. It's my privilege to join the assembly of the stellar scholars here. So my talk is about Buddhist book roads from Turfan to Beijing to Hangzhou in the 13th and 14th century. Basically, the main primary sources that I would like to introduce today is to shift from the text and manuscripts that we have discussed so much in the past 2 days to printed matters. And in this particular case, I would like to invite you to take a closer look at images. And so these are some of the fragments that we will discuss today. My basic argument is by studying these images, I like to suggest that the images found in this part of the world may have been produced actually, very far away. In fact, in Hangzhou, and also I want to think about the persons who commission or sponsor this type of print, and I would argue that they were related to the elite Uyghurs active under the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th century, and they are very active in Beijing, and also they may be related to Hangzhou. So that's the basic argument. in order to place the objects that I study within a more concrete spatial context, I went on to this ambitious project which I could have not done by myself, and that is to map the infrastructure of the Mongol Empire. And so in this talk, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce an interactive map that I already posted online. You can go to my personal website, and then you can see this in more interactive mode. Basically, what my team did is to track the textual records of more than 940 postal relay stations established under the Yuan China in this special context. Amanda already mentioned that, and I appreciate your introduction that my talk is part of my book, forthcoming book. This monstrous book, I'm very grateful that somebody is willing to publish it, and because it's a lot of words. And in addition to that, I plan to publish more than 500 illustrations. And I also customize 17 maps, and hopefully I can show you some of the maps that I would like to include in my book. The topic that I would like to discuss today is related to the 10th chapter, featuring the elite Uyghurs as the middleman of the Buddhist print world. And in terms of the historical framework, this book project covers hundreds of years, starting from famous examples from Huang, and I intentionally want to end around 1450 because I think that in the world history, a lot of people still think about the history of printing and book culture as beginning at the end of this project, namely the Gutenberg Bible was printed around 1450. So I was trained as an art historian. I'm naturally drawn to visual images, although now my interests really span, and I was very inspired by people studying texts across different fields. As I look at the printed materials, especially related to Buddhism, I cannot help but start mapping where they were found, where they were produced, and where they were transmitted. And this is a final map that it came up with. So you can see that there are different colors, and different colors related to different periods. And if I slice these different colors of lines into different slides, they look like this. So you can see that our earliest extant examples are from Huang, but the kind of network that we can map out is very limited. As it moves on, there are more and more archaeological materials that shows the coastal interaction between China and Japan, and also the archaeological materials in the north enable us to see some of the development in the north. When it came to the 13th and 14th century, somehow this network just expanded significantly. And the primary sources that I will introduce today actually fell into this period. Before we dive into the fragments found in Turfan, I would like to introduce three major concepts which I think are fruitful for our discussion of the history of printing and in particular in the Buddhist context. First of all is printing for merit. And I think that this responds to earlier talk, Ronit, about what transmitted fast and what is more slowly. I'm arguing that actually Buddhist book, when it was compounded with this Buddhist notion of merit making, they travel quite fast and also in terms of quantity. And this somehow is especially relevant to the context of China because Mahayana Buddhism spread, promoting the concept of the code of books and encouraging adepts to worship and venerate the books. If we interpret the proliferation of Buddhist print culture as a product of merrymaking, it actually challenges the common idea book scholars, history of book scholars propose, which is to equate larger print runs with a widening readership. One of the examples that I would like to cite here, and I intentionally move beyond Huang to show you some of the later books. This is what I argue one of the most popular Buddhist books circulated around the year of 1450, and that is the time when the Bible was printed. This book instead was printed in Beijing, and you still have lots of copies survive. And what is so exciting about this scripture is that it was the so-called indigenous scripture, made in China. And it has the manuscript counterpart in Dunhuang already. But here, this book, the colophon, shows that it was sponsored by a lay woman Sun, which I call. And she sponsored this in order to transferring the Buddhist merits to her daughter. And her daughter actually had a situation. She was pregnant, the daughter was pregnant, and then suffered from the chest pain. So this mother vowed that if her daughter delivered the baby successfully, she would come back to sponsor Buddhist printing. And here is the happy result because her daughter already had a baby, so she kept her promise and support 1,000 copies instead. There are lots of interesting points to talk about this scripture, and I have a new article coming out soon just talking about this. Here I just want to call your attention to the use of talismans in Buddhist scriptures and how it's is really appealing to women. The second key concept that I would like to share with you is that some scriptures were actually hidden and invisible. They are not really meant to spread. And because numerous Buddhist printed texts were deposited in Buddhist pagodas and statues, including those in China's East Asian neighbors. Here is just a map, a slice of the 11th to 13th century. You can see that in at least two Buddhist statues made in Kamakura, Japan, actually contained Chinese printed sutra inside the statue. And this is related to a question that I asked Bill yesterday because I was very interested in tracing what books have been put into the statues. I'll just show you this. For example, this Jizo statue was made in 13th century Kamakura, Japan, and is now in Germany. When the curator cleaned up the inside interior of the statue, they found all these objects here. Among all these artifacts, most of them were made in Japan, but one very handsome book that was reported to be secure at the very center of this statue is a Lotus Sutra, printed in 12th century Hangzhou. Moving on to the third key concept, and that is the main concept that I would like to elaborate today using the primary sources discovered in Turfan, and that is Buddhist book rolls that I try to evocate. I find it very fruitful when we go beyond, the text-based or image-based study, and to see these Buddhist printed objects as moving objects, and to use them to trace the idea, how ideas travel. My concept of Buddhist book rolls was highly inspired by the following scholarship. One trend of scholarship was initiated by Wang Yong, the scholar teaching at Zhejiang University. Starting from 2003, he coined this term, 书籍之路, or book roll, to talk about Chinese books transported to Japan. And mainly he dealt with the Confucian classics, not really touching upon Buddhist sources. The other very inspiring group of scholarship was the so-called Buddhist Road team, who published very fruitfully in the past few years. The leader of this team is Carmen Maynor, and you can easily download their books. Basically, the Buddhist Road team, they concentrated on the Eastern Central Asia, talking about the Buddhist artifacts, Buddhist cave temples, and so on and so forth. One of the diagrams that they made them ready to download online is this diagram that I share with you here. I find it really inspiring. These dots in different sizes refer to the nodes of ideas. And in the context of the Buddhist Road publications, I think they refer to Buddhist cave temples. What is so interesting about this diagram is the emphasis on the so-called feedback loop. So that's to say that ideas do not transfer or travel only from one point to the other or back again, but it creates this kind of loop. And so the idea, going through different places may come back, and it became a kind of hybrid, entity again. So, all right, that is the general concept of the Buddhist road. But of course, over the past 2 days, I already heard about various roads, such as the cotton roads and also the musk road. And here I just give you 3 examples. There's a book on the metal road and an exhibition about the blue and white ceramics, the so-called blue road. And just recently, this is one of my favorite books this year, Wenxin's The King's Roads. So I think that the concept of the roads really break the boundaries and make the transnational studies more fluid. All right, so from here on, I will, move to the case study, and I would like to take you to Turfan, this area, where fragments of printed sources were preserved, mainly in Berlin. So this group of fragments were related to, Turfan here in the 13th and 14th century context is associated with the Uyghurs' homeland. And I know that a lot of scholars here are familiar with this part of the history, but just for the general audience, I thought that I'd give you some brief introduction of who the Uyghurs I refer to. The Uyghurs, the Uyghurs are the Turkic people who fled the Mongolian plateau to Central Asia in the mid-9th century to establish a regional sedentary state known as the Kingdom of Kocho. They have 2 capitals, one in Turfan or Gaochang and the other Beshbalik. The Uyghurs came from a long-lasting Buddhist background in their motherland in Central Asia. Here are some of the murals still survive. Unfortunately, a lot of murals taken from this site have been bombarded and just lost after World War II. But here you can see that these fragments preserved in Berlin shows the elite Uyghurs, aristocratic Uyghurs, the princess and the prince as devout Buddhist donors, and these were they predate the Mongol period. In 1209, the Uyghur leader was the first head of state to submit voluntarily to Genghis Khan. And because of this relationship, the Mongols trust the Uyghur more and then hire the elite for a lot of upper class work, including being the imperial tutors. But around the later part of the 13th century, the Uyghurs' homeland were gradually absorbed into Chagatai Khanate, and there was a lot of political turmoil going on in their homeland, pushing the leader to move to the northwest China. And because of this political turmoil, also a lot of elite Uyghurs migrated to China and worked for the Mongols. So, as the Mongol scholars concluded, elite Uyghurs are the people in the middle, the brains of the Mongols and the words of the Yuan dynasty. Even the 13th century Flemish Franciscan missionary William of Rubruck commented on the Uyghurs' writing, and they mentioned that the Mongols adopted Uyghur script and that the Uyghurs active as the Mongol rulers' chief scribes. Here are just some examples that you can see that the Mongolian writings were written in the Uyghur script. And here is one of the travel paths used by the Mongols to traverse through their infrastructure. And the writing is also in Uyghur script. In the context of Chinese art studies, when I was a student, the Uyghurs active in the Mongol Yuan period were considered highly Sinicized. And here are just some of the calligraphy written by the elite Uyghurs active in Yuan China. You can see that actually if you combine the study of the Uyghur scholars include such as Peter Zimmer, you know that this famous Yuan dynasty calligrapher Kui Kui or Kiki, he was actually highly bilingual. He has no problem to shift between Chinese cursive script and the Uyghur writing. And he even composed a Uyghur poem inspired by Buddhist scriptures. So this is a fragment found in Turfan, and it was proved by Peter Zimmer and other scholars that it was printed in Dadu in Beijing. The other example, this cursive Chinese calligraphy written by an elite Uyghur scholar, Guan Yunshi, it has this very mysterious signature at the very end. You can see that he emphasized this continuity of vertical strokes. And I couldn't help but compare this with the Uyghur cubit, the movable type Uyghur script, originally found in Dunhuang and now stored in Musée Guimet. There are hundreds of cubes like this. So my point is that when we evaluate the elite Uyghurs' contribution during this period, we really have to think more broadly. All right, so here the fragments discovered in Turfan, they look very small and incomplete. And here I want to thank Asian Art Museum in Berlin for giving me all these sources for the study purpose in the past few years. If we try to put this together, they may look like this, and they brought us to a bigger picture. These are all the fragments I have. So you can see that here on the left part, there are lots of figures. They seem to represent the donors. And on the right part, it is a fragment of what look like a standard Buddhist frontispieces. And altogether, it might reflect a complete frontispiece. there are earlier scholars who make this attempt to do a kind of imaginary stitch, putting them together. For now, this piece seemed to be missing because I couldn't find it anymore. But a lot of historians have tackled the leg part of the overall reconstruction. I think mainly because there are a lot of cartouches in Chinese, and they can find the biographical references in Chinese sources. Let's take a look at this leg part. The remaining fragments, if we piece together, there are at least 47 figures. And so the conclusion that I cited from the historians is that they may reflect a big Uyghur family. And the leader of this family is Meng Su, who was very active in the 13th century before the Yuan dynasty was formally established. He helped Kublai Khan to fight the southern Song. So here I want to zoom in this part so that you can have a closer view of these family figures. Meng Su, I highlighted the figure in red. And in fact, historians refer to them as family portrait. And as an art historian, I have to caution you to use the term portrait because they really look very generic. Kind of every face look very similar. So it's the name tag, the cartouche that identify them. But here I highlight the person standing beside Meng Su. One is his father, and his father was actually a recorded Buddhist leader back in the Uyghur homeland. He has many sons who were documented in Yuan history. One, To Yin, was actually a multilingual Buddhist scholar, participating in the translating and collecting of Buddhist scriptures sponsored by the Yuan court at that time. So if we look at their dress, the fashion, you see that they become Mongolianized. So one of the features of the Mongols' male dress or male clothing is that they wear this core waist. The waist is a high waist, and there are many braided design. So here is a real piece of clothing discovered in Inner Mongolia. They compare closely to the dress illustrated here. Moving on to the women, we notice that a lot of women here, they have this vertical tube-shaped hat, which is called the gugu hat, and that was a signature, Mongol hat worn by aristocratic or imperial figures. Here I give you an example of a famous portrait, Empress Chapi, who is the wife of Kublai Khan. And in fact, this woman that I highlight, based on her name, we know that she was the younger sister of this empress. And if we compare to the earlier murals that I show you back to the Uyghurs' homeland, you can notice that their dress code already changed. Recently, scholars discovered some funerary artifacts, the sculptures, near the Beijing Zoo, and argue that these might be the family graveyard of Meng Su. So because of all these indirect sources, there is a theory trying to relate the fragments that I just showed you to Beijing. And if we look at how this may travel, based on the Mongol postal relay system, if you take the land route plus the river route, you would eventually arrive in Turfan. So I would like to challenge this view by looking at the right part of the reconstruction. Until this day, I don't think any scholar really look at the right part seriously. So here, I want to question the way that previous scholars stitched them together. Let me show you this part first. So here you can see that there are some houses that look like palatial paradise, radiating, and some small figures. There is a balustrade, and so on and so forth. It is very incomplete. I found there is an animal. Did you see this look like the tail of an animal? And it's actually a tiger. I found fragments that can connect to the tiger here, and this fragment is actually not in Berlin, but in Russia. So if we combine these two, it gives you a larger picture. Just to tell you my conclusion, I think that it compares very closely to the fragments of this section of the Lotus Sutra frontispiece, widely reproduced in Hangzhou. And if we compare these, you can see that there is a city gate, two tigers lingering around in front of the city gate. This is a partial representation of what looked like a Buddha preaching that you don't see here. This session that I compare is actually part of this overall frontispiece design made in Hangzhou. And this example I show you is now at National Palace Museum collection in Taipei. And I mark the different narrative or parables for your references. They refer to the sequence discussed in the Lotus Sutra, especially from the 3rd chapter. And the tigers that we see here and the city gate refer to one of the most famous parables in Lotus Sutra, which is the illusionary city, and that is okay. Moving on. So based on this visual comparison, I think that we can assume that the fragments discovered in Turfan might be made in Hangzhou, and the way that it is transported long distance is made possible through this postal relay system. There are other supporting artifacts discovered in Turfan showing that they were actually from Hangzhou, and this is one of the fragments. Showing the carter's name, Chen Ning, was actually quite active in Yuan Dynasty Hangzhou because he cut a lot of blocks of the frontispiece decorating the Buddhist canon known as the Shih-shan canon, produced in Hangzhou. And I also want to show you this. From now on, we don't want to throw away wrapping paper easily because these are two pieces of wrapping paper discovered in Turfan's Buddhist caves. And they actually show you the shop, the name of the shop of Hangzhou. And here I give you the translation. They specialize in this golden flake paper, which was supposed to be used to decorate the surface of the Buddhist sculptures. And I was very curious about the address stated on this paper. So I did a little bit more digging and look at the 13th century local gazetteer in Hangzhou. I was able to find their address in this neighborhood. So, for this, I would turn to my map, and I know that I have no time to show you, but please do check out. You can go to my personal website, Shih-shan-SusanHuang.com, and then on the upper right corner, you can click the map, and then it would take you to an interactive, website. The point for me, I am not a scholar of postal relay system. For me, the reason why to map it up is to do something else. So in my website, I overlap this infrastructure with the centers of printing that I identify. I also overlap other layer of 100 Buddhist temples that collected the Buddhist canon and also sponsored by an elite Uyghur to see how the book production might have been related to the infrastructure. So if you use my website, you can zoom in to see the place name. And overall, the Mongol postal relay system, you can think of it as a kind of blown up subway map with Beijing or Dadu in the Yuan Dynasty term as the center. It has the dot route referred to the water route, the solid route referred to the land route. But there are places where we are not so sure because a lot of stations have been lost and we couldn't find it. And these unsure routes refer especially to, for example, the Mongolian area or the Tibetan area. Like here. And I think that I would just conclude here by saying that, over the centuries, we have been doing a lot of great scholarship by focusing, within a cultural domain or within a discipline, such as art history or Buddhism and medicine and so on and so forth. But this conference really encouraged us to go beyond our own comfort zone. And I really, truly learned a lot from you. Thank you so much.